The scent of papyrus and salt air has a way of lingering in the mind, much like the slow, rhythmic pulse of the Nile as it meets the Mediterranean Sea. If you were to stand on the limestone docks of Alexandria in the 1st century before the Common Era, you would hear the soft, rhythmic slapping of water against the hulls of cedar ships and the distant, muffled chime of bells from the temples of Isis. The city does not sleep so much as it breathes. A vast, sprawling lungs of marble and gold that has inhaled the wisdom of the world for nearly 300 years. This is a place where the air itself feels heavy with the weight of ancient secrets, where the heat of the Egyptian sun is tempered by a cool northerly breeze that carries the faint aroma of frankincense and drying ink from the great library. In these quiet moments, it is easy to forget that the world outside is changing, shifting like the sands of the deep desert. The Ptolemaic Dynasty, the Greek kings and queens who have ruled Egypt since the death of Alexander the Great, are no longer the titans they once were. Their power is beginning to fray at the edges, like a fine linen garment that has been worn through many generations. To the west, across the wine-dark sea, the shadow of Rome is growing longer and colder, a disciplined machine of iron and law that looks upon the wealth of the Nile with a hunger that cannot be easily satisfied. And yet, within the palace walls of Alexandria, a child is born who will become the final guardian of this fading glory. Cleopatra. The 7th is not merely a princess of a dying house, she is a scholar of the highest order, a woman who understands that the true strength of a ruler lies not just in armies, but in the mastery of the mind and the preservation of tradition. As you settle into your blankets and let the weight of the day drift away, you might imagine the young Cleopatra walking through the cool, shadowed halls of the Museion. This was the intellectual heart of the ancient world, a place of silent study where the scratching of reeds on parchment was the only sound to break the stillness. Before we journey deeper into the life of this remarkable queen, I want to take a moment to acknowledge you as you find your own place of rest tonight. You are here at the Slumber Archives, and it is a pleasure to have you with us. We share new historical narrations just like this one every single day, so if you find peace in these stories, please do consider subscribing so you never miss a night of quiet reflection. A simple like of this video also helps other weary travelers find their way to our community. Now, let us return to the marble halls of Alexandria, where a young queen is preparing for a throne she was born to protect. Cleopatra's early years were spent in a world of profound intellectual depth. While her ancestors often struggled with the complexities of Egyptian culture, preferring to remain isolated in their Greek language and customs, Cleopatra was different. She possessed a restless, searching intelligence that led her to spend countless hours in the great library, a place where the knowledge of the Greeks, the Persians, the Hebrews, and the ancient Egyptians was gathered into a single, silent sanctuary. She was the first of her line to learn the Egyptian language, a gesture of profound respect for the people she would one day rule. One can imagine her sitting by a flickering oil lamp, tracing the intricate shapes of hieroglyphs and feeling the connection to a past that stretched back thousands of years before her own birth. The concept of the last pharaoh is a heavy one. It carries with it a sense of inevitable ending, but also a profound duty of care. Cleopatra understood that she was the bridge between an ancient, divine past and an uncertain Roman future. To her, being a queen was a form of sacred stewardship. She saw herself as the living embodiment of Isis, the goddess of magic and motherhood, a figure who could weave together the disparate threads of her kingdom into a single, unbreakable tapestry. As she moved through the palace, her steps were measured and purposeful, her mind always calculating the shifting alliances of the Mediterranean. She watched as her father, Ptolemy XII, struggled to keep his throne against the backdrop of Roman interference, and in those difficult years she learned the subtle art of political survival. The atmosphere of the Ptolemaic court was one of opulence and intrigue, a place where silk tapestries muffled the sounds of whispered conspiracies, and the air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive oils. Within this environment, Cleopatra cultivated a presence that was both ethereal and deeply grounded. She was not merely a figurehead, she was a philosopher queen who understood the power of spectacle and the importance of symbols. She knew that to lead Egypt, she must be more than a monarch. She must be the personification of the Nile itself, eternal and life-giving. The great library was her training ground, a labyrinth of scrolls where she studied mathematics, astronomy, and rhetoric, honing her voice into an instrument of persuasion that was said to be as varied and beautiful as a many-stringed lyre. As the years passed and the political climate grew increasingly volatile, Cleopatra remained a steady point in a turning world. She watched the stars from the roofs of the palace, observing the same celestial movements that the pyramid builders had tracked 3,000 years before her. There is a certain comfort in that continuity, the idea that despite the rise and fall of empires, the heavens remain unchanged. She drew strength from this, seeing herself as part of a long, unbroken chain of tradition. The looming shadow of Rome was not something she feared with a trembling heart, but rather something she analyzed with a cold, strategic eye. She knew that the old ways of war would not suffice against the legions, and so she prepared to use the weapons she knew best, her intellect, her charisma, and her unwavering devotion to the legacy of the pharaohs. In the quiet of the night, as Alexandria slept under a blanket of stars, Cleopatra would often look out across the harbor toward the Pharaoh's lighthouse. Its great beam of light cut through the darkness, a guiding star for all who sought the shores of Egypt. It was a symbol of her city's preeminence, a testament to the heights that human ingenuity could reach. To Cleopatra, that light was a promise that even as the twilight of her dynasty approached, she would ensure that the flame of Egyptian culture would burn brightly one last time. She was the guardian of a world that was slowly beginning to fade, a woman who stood at the edge of history and refused to be forgotten. And as we drift further into our own quiet thoughts, we can almost hear the soft rustle of her robes on the marble floor, a sound that signals the beginning of a reign that would echo through the centuries, long after the last stone of the palace had crumbled into the sea. In the quiet libraries of the Museion, where the scent of aged papyrus and cedar oil hangs heavy in the still air, a young girl sits amidst towers of scrolls, her eyes tracing the rhythmic curves of scripts that have survived for thousands of years. This is not merely a princess passing the hours in idle study, but a mind being forged in the fires of antiquity's greatest intellectual furnace. Cleopatra was a child of Alexandria, a city built on the intersection of 3 continents, and she understood, perhaps better than any who came before her, that the true power of a ruler lies not in the sharpness of the sword, but in the precision of the tongue. While her predecessors in the Ptolemaic Dynasty were content to rule from within the gilded cage of their Greek heritage, rarely bothering to learn the local dialects of the land they governed, Cleopatra chose a different path, a path of immersion and profound linguistic curiosity. It is said by the ancient chroniclers that she possessed a voice like a many-stringed instrument, capable of turning her speech to whatever idiom was required of her. She did not merely learn, she absorbed. She mastered the elegant, rolling cadences of Greek, the sharp, administrative clarity of Latin, and the flowing melodic tongues of the Hebrews, the Arabs, and the Medes. But it was her devotion to the ancient Egyptian language that truly set the foundation for her reign. To her subjects along the banks of the Nile, the Greek-speaking court in Alexandria often felt like a foreign occupation, distant and cold. Yet Cleopatra reached across that divide. She was the first of her line to speak the language of the common farmer, the priest, and the scribe. When she spoke to the people of the Delta or the dwellers of Upper Egypt, she did so without the need for an interpreter, removing the veil that had separated the crown from the soil for nearly 300 years. Imagine the soft murmur of her voice as she discussed the rising of the river or the rituals of the temples, speaking in the very same tongue the pharaohs had used a millennium before. This was not just a gesture of respect. It was a masterful political maneuver, a way of weaving herself into the very fabric of Egyptian identity, until she was no longer seen as a foreign queen, but as the living embodiment of the land itself. As she moved through the vast halls of the great library, her education extended far beyond the nuances of grammar and syntax. The air around her was often filled with the gentle scratching of quills and the low hum of scholars debating the mysteries of the cosmos. Cleopatra immersed herself in the rigors of mathematics and the abstract beauty of geometry, finding a sense of order in the complex calculations of the stars. She studied the movements of the planets, watching as the night sky shifted over the Mediterranean, learning to predict the celestial cycles that dictated the seasons of the harvest. In the quiet of the evening, she would ponder the philosophical teachings of the Stoics and the Epicureans, seeking to understand the nature of virtue and the weight of duty. These were not merely academic exercises. They were the tools she would eventually use to navigate the treacherous waters of international diplomacy. She learned how to construct an argument with the logic of a geometer and how to read the intentions of others with the insight of a poet. Every scroll she unrolled, every theorem she solved, and every poem she memorized became a thread in the intricate tapestry of her intellect. One can almost see her leaning over a map of the known world, the light of a single oil lamp casting long, flickering shadows against the stone walls. She would have seen the growing shadow of Rome to the west, a rising tide of iron and ambition, and realized that her survival would depend on her ability to outthink and outmaneuver men who saw the world only in terms of conquest. Her education was her fortress. While others focused on the pageantry of the court, Cleopatra was busy building an intellectual foundation that was as unshakable as the pyramids. And so, as the years passed and the young princess grew into a woman of formidable presence, her reputation began to spread far beyond the palace gates. She was known not just for her lineage, but for a brilliance that could illuminate the darkest corners of a council chamber. She understood that to lead a nation, one must first understand the soul of its people, and to understand the soul, one must speak the language of their hearts. The weight of her future was beginning to settle upon her shoulders, yet she carried it with a grace born of deep knowledge. She was a polyglot, a philosopher, and a strategist, waiting for the moment when the winds of history would finally fill her sails. In the silence of the library, among the ghosts of poets and the whispers of dead kings, she prepared herself for a role that would require every ounce of her wit and every syllable of her many languages. The world was changing, and the last of the pharaohs was ready to meet it, not with the clatter of armor, but with the quiet, steady power of a mind that had mastered the art of being everything to everyone. The heavy metallic scent of incense and old papyrus often hung in the air of the royal chambers, a constant reminder of the weight of the crown that was about to change hands. In the year 51 before the Common Era, the long turbulent reign of Ptolemy XII, known to his subjects as Auletes the Flutist, finally came to an end. He left behind a kingdom that was a shadow of its former glory, heavily indebted to Rome and fractured by internal dissent, yet his final will was a document of profound consequence. He decreed that his eldest daughter, Cleopatra, now 18 years of age, should rule jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, who was then a mere boy of 10. To ensure this fragile arrangement held, the king placed the siblings under the guardianship of the Roman Republic, effectively inviting the wolf to watch over the fold. As the funeral pyres cooled and the mourning period began, The atmosphere in the palace of Alexandria shifted from grief to a sharp, cold calculation. Cleopatra stood at the threshold of her destiny, but she found herself in a court that was less a sanctuary and more a labyrinth of whispered conspiracies. The tradition of sibling marriage and joint rule was a cornerstone of the Ptolemaic Dynasty, designed to keep the bloodline pure and the power concentrated, yet it rarely resulted in harmony. For Cleopatra, the challenge was not merely her brother, but the powerful men who stood behind him. 3 figures in particular moved through the shadows of the court like ghosts: Pothinus the eunuch, Achillas the commander of the royal guard, and Theodotus the rhetorician. They saw in the young boy king a vessel for their own ambitions, a puppet whose strings they could pull from behind the heavy silk curtains of the throne room. The tension began to simmer almost immediately, a low hum of discord that vibrated through the marble halls. Cleopatra was not content to be a figurehead or a silent partner in her brother's minority. She possessed a mind that had been sharpened by the finest tutors in the Mediterranean, and she understood, perhaps better than anyone else in the palace, that the survival of Egypt depended on a strong, singular vision. While the advisers of her brother sought to isolate her, she began to assert her independent sovereignty with a quiet, methodical grace. She did not wait for permission to act. In the early months of her reign, official documents began to appear bearing only her name, and coins were struck that featured her image alone, her profile rendered with the firm, determined chin of her ancestors. She spent her days navigating the intricate protocols of the Alexandrian court, a place where a single misplaced word could lead to exile or worse. The city outside the palace walls was a vibrant, chaotic tapestry of Greeks, Egyptians, Jews, and Romans, and Cleopatra knew that to rule them she had to be seen as their true protector. She travelled south, away from the Hellenistic Polish of Alexandria, into the heart of ancient Egypt, where the Nile dictated the rhythm of life. It was here, among the towering pylons of the temples and the vast, sun-drenched fields of grain, that she began to cultivate a different kind of power. She spoke to the priests in their own tongue, the first of her line to do so, and she presented herself not as a foreign conqueror, but as the living embodiment of Isis. This was a strategic masterstroke, a way to bypass the scheming eunuchs in the capital by securing the undying loyalty of the Egyptian people. Meanwhile, back in the palace, the air grew thick with the scent of betrayal. Pothinus and his associates watched Cleopatra's rising influence with a mixture of fear and resentment. They recognized that she was far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated, a woman who could not be easily manipulated or frightened into submission. They began a systematic campaign to undermine her authority, whispering in the young Ptolemy's ear that his sister intended to usurp his throne entirely. The palace, once a place of learning and luxury, became a fortress of secrets. Every meal was a potential source of poison, every servant a potential spy. Cleopatra lived in a state of constant, quiet vigilance, her nights spent reading by the flicker of a lamp, listening to the distant sound of the Mediterranean waves crashing against the Pharaoh's lighthouse. The struggle for the soul of Egypt was not just a family quarrel, it was a battle of ideologies. On one side stood the traditionalists and the court bureaucrats who favoured a weak monarchy they could control, and on the other stood a young queen who envisioned a revived, sovereign Egypt that could stand as an equal to the rising tide of Rome. As the months stretched into years, the friction between the two factions reached a breaking point. Cleopatra's attempts to govern independently were met with increasing resistance from the royal council, who worked tirelessly to strip her of her executive powers. They restricted her access to the treasury and surrounded her brother with a wall of loyalists, effectively creating a rival court within the same walls. Despite these obstacles, Cleopatra remained undeterred. She was a master of the long game, a weaver of alliances who understood that power was often found in the spaces between people. She continued to build her network of supporters, reaching out to the landed gentry and the merchant classes who were weary of the instability that had plagued the reign of her father. She presented herself as the steady hand, the one who could restore the economy and ensure the regular flow of the Nile's bounty. Her voice, described by later historians as a many-stringed instrument, became her most potent weapon. She could charm a diplomat in elegant Greek, debate a philosopher in liquid Latin, and command a general with the steely resolve of a seasoned commander. But the court eunuchs were not without their own resources. They leveraged the young king's growing ego, feeding him tales of his own greatness and painting his sister as an obstacle to his divine right to rule. By the year 49, the rift had become an abyss. The city of Alexandria, usually so full of music and trade, felt the chill of an approaching storm. Riots began to break out in the streets, fueled by bread shortages and the inflammatory rhetoric of the king's supporters. Cleopatra realized that the palace had become a gilded cage, and that if she stayed, she risked being silenced forever. The power struggle was no longer a matter of politics. It had become a matter of survival. In the quiet hours before dawn, when the city was draped in a silver mist, Cleopatra made the difficult decision to flee the capital. She did not leave as a defeated refugee, but as a queen in exile, her mind already turning toward the next move on the chessboard. She traveled east toward the border of Syria, a region where she could gather an army and prepare for an eventual return. The journey was long and arduous, a far cry from the cushioned litters and silken canopies of her life in Alexandria. She slept in tents under the vast, star-strewn desert sky, the silence of the dunes a stark contrast to the constant chatter of the court. As she sat by the embers of a campfire, watching the sparks rise toward the constellations, she must have reflected on the will of her father and the heavy burden of the Ptolemaic legacy. The inheritance of Auletes had given her a crown, but it had also given her a civil war. She was now a queen without a kingdom, a ruler without a throne, yet she possessed something that her brother and his advisers could never take away, a profound understanding of the world's shifting currents. She knew that Rome was watching, that the great generals of the Republic were already looking toward the wealth of Egypt with hungry eyes. Her task was not just to reclaim her place in Alexandria, but to do so in a way that would preserve the independence of her country, in the face of an empire that seemed destined to swallow everything in its path. The desert wind whispered through the scrub brush, carrying the scent of salt and ancient dust. Cleopatra waited, her patience as deep as the Nile itself. She was gathering her strength, recruiting mercenaries, and building a base of power among the Arab tribes who respected her courage and her lineage. She was no longer just the daughter of a king. She was a woman who had tasted both the splendor of the palace and the grit of the wilderness. The initial power struggles had tempered her, turning her intellect into a blade that was ready to be drawn when the time was right. The eunuchs in Alexandria might have thought they had won, that they had successfully purged the court of its most formidable mind, but they had only succeeded in moving the battle to a larger stage. And so, while Ptolemy XIII sat on a throne he did not truly control, surrounded by men who looked at him and saw only an opportunity, his sister was forging a new path. She was learning the art of command, the logistics of warfare, and the delicate balance of leading men who owed her nothing but their pay. She was preparing for a return that would change the course of history, a return that would not only reclaim her inheritance, but would eventually bring her face to face with the most powerful man in the known world. The will of Auletes had set the wheels in motion, but it was Cleopatra's own will, her unyielding strategic genius that would determine where those wheels would eventually lead. The reign of the last pharaoh was only just beginning, and the world, though it did not yet know it, was about to be transformed by the quiet, steady power of a queen who refused to be forgotten. The scent of scorched cedar and sun-baked silt hung heavy over the harbour of Alexandria in the year 48, before the Common Era, as the political atmosphere grew as stifling as the desert wind. Behind the marble facades of the royal palace, the delicate balance of power had finally fractured. Cleopatra, a queen in title but increasingly a prisoner in her own court, watched as the influence of her younger brother's advisers, the eunuch Pothinus, the rhetorician Theodotus, and the general Achillas, crystallized into a sharp, decisive blade. They did not merely wish to share power, they sought to erase her from the lineage entirely. A silent coup unfolded within the corridors of power, a series of whispers and redirected commands that eventually left the young queen with a harrowing choice: to remain and face a quiet execution, or to vanish into the vast, unforgiving horizon of the East. She chose the horizon. Under the cover of a moonless Mediterranean night, Cleopatra slipped away from the city she loved, leaving behind the great library and the Pharaoh's lighthouse, those towering monuments to the intellect and reach of her ancestors. She did not flee in terror, but rather with the cold, calculated precision of a chess player who understands that a temporary retreat is often the precursor to a checkmate. Her journey took her toward the dusty, windswept borderlands of Syria, a region where the grip of the Alexandrian court was weak, and the loyalty of the local desert tribes could be bought with the promise of future glory. It was here, amidst the shifting dunes and the ancient sun-bleached stones of the Levant, that the deposed queen began the arduous task of rebuilding her destiny from the very sand beneath her feet. Life in the Syrian desert was a stark departure from the perfumed halls of the Ptolemaic palace. Instead of silken couches and cooling fans, there were the rough canvases of nomadic tents and the rhythmic, low lowing of camels in the twilight. Yet Cleopatra possessed a remarkable fluidity of character, an ability to adapt her royal dignity to the rugged necessities of a military camp. She spent her days negotiating with local chieftains, speaking to them in their own tongues, and convincing them that her cause was not merely a family dispute, but a chance to align themselves with the true and rightful sovereign of the Nile. Slowly, man by man and horse by horse, an army began to take shape. It was a mosaic of mercenaries, desert warriors, and loyalists who had followed her into exile, all bound together by the sheer force of her personality and the unwavering conviction in her voice. As she waited, Cleopatra practiced a form of strategic patience that few leaders of her age could master. She understood that the desert was not just a hiding place but a forge. While her brother Ptolemy XIII sat on a precarious throne in Alexandria, surrounded by manipulative men who sought to rule through him, Cleopatra was becoming a commander in her own right. She studied the logistics of supply lines and the temperament of her soldiers, all while keeping a watchful eye on the great sea to the west. She knew that Egypt was never an island, and that the internal squabbles of her house were inextricably linked to the gargantuan struggle currently tearing the Roman Republic apart. The world was shrinking, and the shadows of two Roman giants, Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, were lengthening across the Mediterranean, threatening to swallow everything in their path. The Roman Civil War had reached a fever pitch, and its ripples were finally washing up on the shores of the eastern provinces. Pompey the Great, once the most celebrated general in Rome, had been defeated by Caesar at the Battle of Pharsalus and was now a fugitive, desperately seeking a sanctuary where he could regroup and reclaim his lost prestige. He turned his eyes toward Egypt, remembering the long-standing debts the house of Ptolemy owed to Rome, and specifically to him. As Pompey's lone galley crested the horizon, heading toward the Egyptian coast, the fragile equilibrium of Cleopatra's exile was shattered. She recognized that the arrival of such a man would act as a catalyst, forcing her brother's hand and perhaps providing the very opening she had been waiting for in the stillness of the Syrian sands. The air in the desert camp grew electric with anticipation as news of Pompey's approach reached Cleopatra's ears. She understood the gravity of the moment better than anyone. If her brother welcomed Pompey, Egypt would become the primary battlefield for the Roman war, likely inviting the wrath of Julius Caesar. If they rejected him, they risked offending the traditional Roman establishment. From her vantage point in the east, Cleopatra watched the pieces move across the board with a mixture of apprehension and grim fascination. She saw the desperation of Pompey and the calculated cruelty of her brother's advisers, who were even then debating how to handle the arrival of a fallen titan. It was a moment of profound historical tension, where the fate of an ancient kingdom hung on the decision of a few men in a seaside pavilion. In the quiet hours of the night, as the campfires dimmed to glowing embers and the stars of the desert sky shone with an almost liquid brilliance, one can imagine Cleopatra reflecting on the nature of power. She had been cast out, stripped of her finery and her capital, yet she remained a queen because she refused to see herself as anything less. Her resilience was not born of arrogance, but of a deep, historical understanding of her role as the last of the pharaohs. She was the bridge between the old world of the god-kings and the new world of Roman iron. As the news came that Pompey had reached the shores of Pelusium, near where her own army was now stationed, she prepared herself for the inevitable collision of worlds, a collision that would either bury her in the sands of Syria or carry her back to the throne on a tide of Roman blood and Egyptian gold. The arrival of Pompey the Great was not the triumphant return of a saviour, but the tragic arrival of a ghost. When he stepped off his boat onto the Egyptian sand, he was met not with a royal procession, but with the cold steel of Achilles' blade. The advisers of Ptolemy XIII had decided that dead men do not bite, and that the best way to please the approaching Julius Caesar was to present him with the head of his greatest rival. From her camp, Cleopatra likely heard the echoes of this betrayal with a shudder of realization. The rules of the game had changed. The Roman civil war had officially arrived on her doorstep, and the man who had ordered Pompey's death, her own brother, had just committed a blunder of catastrophic proportions. By murdering a Roman consul on Egyptian soil, the boy king had invited the master of Rome to enter the palace, not as a guest, but as an arbiter. Meanwhile, the dust of the Syrian desert continued to swirl around Cleopatra's tent, a constant reminder of the grit and endurance required to survive this exile. She knew that Caesar would be arriving soon, following the trail of his fallen enemy, and she knew that her brother's advisers would do everything in their power to prevent her from meeting him. They would paint her as a rebel, a fugitive, and a traitress to the crown. To regain her kingdom, she would need more than just an army of desert tribesmen. She would need to bypass the blockade of her brother's fleet and the walls of his palace. She would need a masterstroke of ingenuity, a way to present herself to Caesar that would bypass the politics of the court and appeal directly to the man who now held the fate of the world in his hands. As the sun rose over the eastern hills, casting long golden shadows across the encampment, Cleopatra began to formulate a plan that would become the stuff of legend. She looked toward the sea, toward Alexandria, the city that shimmered like a mirage in her memory. The strategic patience she had cultivated in the wilderness had sharpened her mind to a fine point. She was no longer just a young woman fleeing a coup. She was a sovereign awaiting her moment. The Roman Civil War had brought the world to her feet, and though she was currently a queen without a palace, she was a queen who understood that the true seat of power was not a throne of gold, but the intangible space where intellect, charm, and timing converged. The desert had tested her, the exile had tempered her, and now the arrival of the Romans would provide the stage for her greatest performance. The shifting sands of Syria had been a harsh teacher, but they had granted her something the palace never could, a perspective from the outside looking in. She saw the fragility of the Ptolemaic Dynasty and the overwhelming momentum of the Roman Republic. She saw that for Egypt to survive, it could no longer stand apart, but must instead become the jewel in the crown of the New World Order. With this realization, the Queen gathered her resolve. The time for waiting was drawing to a close. The air was thick with the scent of salt and the impending storm of history. As she prepared to move her forces closer to the border, Cleopatra looked one last time at the vast, silent desert that had been her home and her fortress. The next chapter of her life would not be written in the sand, but in the marble halls of her ancestors, where a Roman general was about to discover that the last pharaoh was a woman unlike any he had ever encountered. The rhythmic clatter of Roman sandals upon the limestone docks of Alexandria signalled a shift in the very foundations of the world, a sound that echoed through the salt-misted air as Gaius Julius Caesar stepped onto the soil of Egypt. He had come not as a conqueror, but as a pursuer, following the trail of his great rival Pompey Magnus across the Mediterranean, only to find that the young advisers of Ptolemy XIII had already taken the liberty of ending Pompey's life. They presented Caesar with the severed head of his former friend, expecting gratitude and a swift departure, but they had miscalculated the nature of the man. Caesar was a man of tradition and Roman dignity, and the sight of a Roman consul dispatched by those he considered subordinates filled him with a cold, simmering fury. He entered the city with his lictors and the symbols of Roman authority, taking up residence in the royal palace and declaring that, as the representative of Rome, he would now act as the final arbiter in the bitter civil war between the brother and sister who both claimed the throne. The city was a tinderbox, and Cleopatra, currently exiled and encamped in the eastern deserts, knew that her brother's forces held the palace under a tight blockade. To approach the gates openly was to invite certain death, yet she understood with a piercing clarity that if she did not reach Caesar before her brother's ministers poisoned his mind against her, her cause would be lost forever. And so she devised a plan that was as much a stroke of theatrical genius as it was a desperate gamble for survival. Under the cover of a darkening sky, as the stars began to flicker over the great harbour, she boarded a small, unassuming merchant boat with only a few trusted companions, including a loyal Sicilian named Apollodorus. They drifted through the water like shadows, slipping past the Egyptian warships and the watchful eyes of the guards, the gentle lapping of the waves against the hull, the only sound in the humid night. When they reached the base of the palace walls, the problem remained of how to enter the royal quarters without being intercepted by her brother's spies. It was here that history and legend intertwined, creating an image that has endured for over 2,000 years. Cleopatra lay down upon a large, heavy sack used for carrying laundry, or perhaps, as the story has been told through the generations, she was rolled into a thick, ornate carpet of exquisite weave. Apollodorus gathered the bundle onto his shoulder, walking past the palace guards with the nonchalant air of a servant delivering a gift or a piece of furniture to the Roman general. The weight of her body must have been light, but the weight of her ambition was immense as she lay in the darkness of the fabric, listening to the muffled sounds of the palace, the distant chatter of soldiers, the flickering of torchlight through the weave, and the heavy thud of sandals on stone. When they finally reached the inner chambers, where Caesar sat late into the night, poring over maps and dispatches by the glow of oil lamps, Apollodorus untied the cord and allowed the bundle to unfurl. Out stepped the young queen, perhaps somewhat dishevelled from her journey, but possessed of an iron composure that immediately commanded the room. Caesar was a man who had seen the wonders of the world, a man who had conquered Gaul and crossed the Rubicon, yet he found himself momentarily speechless. He saw before him not just a woman of royal blood, but a mind that mirrored his own, a strategist who understood the power of the grand gesture and the necessity of boldness. Their connection was instantaneous and profound, transcending the simple politics of the moment. While Cleopatra was certainly beautiful, it was her voice, described by ancient historians as a multi-stringed instrument, and her immense intellectual range that truly captivated the Roman general. She spoke to him in his own language and in many others, discussing philosophy, history, and the intricacies of Hellenistic governance. In the quiet, marble-lined halls of the palace, as the rest of Alexandria slept or plotted in the shadows, these two titans of history found in each other a rare kind of equality. Caesar saw in Cleopatra the perfect instrument for Roman interests in the East, a ruler who was brilliant, capable, and entirely dependent on his support to maintain her throne. Cleopatra, in turn, saw in Caesar the ultimate leverage. He was the personification of Rome's unstoppable might, the only force capable of sweeping away her brother's regents and restoring her to her father's heritage. As the candles burned low and the first pale light of dawn began to touch the Pharos lighthouse, the political landscape of Egypt had been irrevocably altered. Caesar, who had arrived as a mediator, now found himself a partisan, deeply entwined with the fate of the woman who had appeared from a carpet to claim her destiny. He formally declared that the will of their father, Ptolemaic Auletes, must be honored, which meant that Cleopatra and her brother were to rule together as co-regents. This was, of course, a diplomatic fiction that favored Cleopatra, as she now had the backing of the Roman legions. The ministers of Ptolemy XIII were horrified, realizing that their grip on power was slipping away into the hands of a woman they had tried to discard. The air in the palace grew heavy with the scent of lilies and the underlying metallic tang of sharpening swords. The city outside was beginning to stir, a vast metropolis of nearly 1 million souls who were becoming increasingly resentful of the Roman presence. Caesar and Cleopatra remained within the royal quarter, a gilded cage where they were both masters and prisoners of the escalating tension. They spent their days in deep conversation, walking through the lush palace gardens where the papyrus reeds swayed in the breeze, discussing the future of the Mediterranean world. Caesar was fascinated by the ancient traditions of the pharaohs, the way the Nile dictated the rhythm of life and the immense wealth that flowed from the black soil of the delta. Meanwhile, the young Ptolemy XIII, fueled by the whispers of his adviser Pothinus, felt the sting of humiliation. He saw his sister, whom he had driven into the wilderness, now sitting at the side of the most powerful man in the world, sharing his table and his counsels. The sibling rivalry that had begun as a court intrigue was now escalating into a full-scale war, with Rome acting as the ultimate arbiter. The Roman presence in Alexandria was small, only a few thousand men compared to the massive Egyptian royal army that was now being summoned back to the city. Caesar, ever confident and perhaps a bit reckless in his pursuit of the queen, had allowed himself to be caught in a precarious position. He was trapped in the palace complex, surrounded by a hostile population and an approaching army, with only his wits and the brilliance of Cleopatra to sustain him. But even as the threat of battle loomed, the intellectual and romantic bond between the two continued to flourish. They were both outsiders in their own way. Caesar, a populist aristocrat who had broken the laws of his own republic, and Cleopatra, a Greek queen ruling over an Egyptian people who viewed her as a living goddess. In the quiet moments between the planning of defences and the receiving of envoys, they found a shared language of power and ambition. Cleopatra showed him the vast libraries of Alexandria, the scrolls that contained the sum of human knowledge, and she spoke of a world where East and West might be joined under a single, enlightened rule. The arrival of Caesar had started as a quest for a Roman enemy, but it had transformed into something far more complex. It was the beginning of a partnership that would reshape the map of the ancient world. The strategic genius of the last pharaoh had found its match, and as the Roman ships sat in the harbour and the Egyptian sun climbed higher into the sky, the stage was set for a conflict that would test their resolve to its very limit. The marble halls of the Ptolemies, once silent witnesses to centuries of dynastic struggle, were now the centre of a global drama. Cleopatra knew that her gamble had worked. She was no longer a fugitive in the desert, but a queen in the arms of the man who held the world in his hands. The storm was coming, but for now, in the cool shadows of the palace, there was a brief, shimmering moment of triumph, a sense that history was being written in the very air they breathed. The city of Alexandria, with its wide boulevards and its towering monuments, seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first spark that would ignite the inevitable explosion. And in the heart of the palace, the Queen of Egypt and the Consul of Rome watched the horizon, knowing that their lives and the fate of their empires were now inextricably linked, woven together as tightly as the fibers of the carpet that had brought her to his feet. The reign of Cleopatra was no longer just a struggle for a throne. It had become a quest for an eternal legacy, one that would be forged in the fire of the coming war and tempered by the cold, hard reality of Roman steel. As the shadows lengthened across the Mediterranean, the story of the last pharaoh was moving into a new, more dangerous light, where the brilliance of her mind would be her greatest weapon against the encroaching darkness. The smell of cedarwood smoke and salty Mediterranean brine began to drift through the narrow, marble-lined corridors of the royal palace, a scent that signaled the end of diplomacy and the beginning of a desperate struggle for survival. Inside the sprawling complex of the Bricaion, the royal quarter of Alexandria, Cleopatra found herself in a paradoxical position. She was a queen in her own capital, yet she was effectively a prisoner of war, shielded only by the presence of Julius Caesar and his small, battle-hardened escort of Roman legionaries. The city she loved, a jewel of the ancient world with its soaring white towers and bustling harbours, had turned into a labyrinth of hostility as the forces of her brother Ptolemy XIII surged forward to reclaim the throne. The air grew thick with the sound of rhythmic shouting and the distant clatter of shields, a low, constant hum that vibrated through the palace walls. Outside, the great harbour was a chaotic tapestry of shifting sails and flickering torches. Caesar, realizing that his small force was hopelessly outnumbered by the Egyptian army and the angry Alexandrian mob, made a harrowing strategic decision that would forever haunt the history of human knowledge. He ordered his men to set fire to the Egyptian fleet docked in the harbour, hoping to create a barrier of flame that would prevent the enemy from surrounding the palace by sea. As the wind caught the sparks, the fire leapt from the decks of the ships to the warehouses lining the docks. And then, according to the mournful accounts of later historians, it reached the great library. From her high balcony, Cleopatra might have watched the orange glow illuminate the night sky, seeing the smoke carry away the charred fragments of scrolls that contained the wisdom of centuries. It was a moment of profound loss. Yet in the heart of this urban nightmare, her resolve did not waver. She remained at Caesar's side, a calm and calculated presence amidst the mounting terror of the siege. For months, the royal quarter became a fortress within a city. The streets were blocked with hastily constructed barricades of stone and timber, and the once elegant gardens were churned into muddy staging grounds for skirmishes. Life inside the palace took on a strange rhythmic quality. The days were marked by the sound of Roman engineers digging wells to find fresh water after the city's conduits were fouled with salt, and the nights were spent in quiet consultation over maps and flickering oil lamps. Cleopatra moved through these spaces with a quiet grace, her very existence a testament to her endurance. She was not merely a figurehead or a prize to be won. She was a partner in the defense, her intimate knowledge of the city's geography and its people providing Caesar with insights that no Roman centurion could possess. The warfare was intimate and brutal, fought house by house and courtyard by courtyard. There were moments when the Roman line nearly buckled, moments when the shouting of the mob seemed to press against the very doors of the royal apartments. Yet even as the walls trembled under the impact of siege engines, Cleopatra maintained the dignity of a pharaoh. She understood that this was the crucible in which her future would be forged. If she could survive this winter of fire and steel, she would emerge not as a supplicant to Rome, but as a ruler who had weathered the storm alongside its greatest general. As the weeks turned into months, the tension within the palace was mirrored by the political machinations outside. Ptolemy XIII, guided by his advisers, sought to rally the people of Egypt to his cause, painting Cleopatra as a traitor who had sold her soul to the Roman invaders. But the young king lacked the strategic depth of his sister. He was a pawn in a game he did not fully understand, while Cleopatra was the master of the board. She waited, with a patient, predatory stillness, knowing that Caesar's reinforcements were marching through the deserts of Syria and Cilicia, drawing closer with every passing day. The turning point arrived in the early spring, when the Roman relief force under Mithridates of Pergamum finally reached the outskirts of the city. The siege of Alexandria was about to break. Caesar, showing the tactical brilliance that had conquered Gaul, led his troops out of the royal quarter to join forces with his allies. The final battle took place near the banks of the Nile, a landscape of reeds and silt that had seen the rise and fall of countless dynasties. The Egyptian army, though vast, could not withstand the disciplined fury of the combined Roman forces. In the chaos of the retreat, as the sun dipped low over the delta, the young Ptolemy XIII attempted to escape across the river. The weight of his golden armor, once a symbol of his divine right to rule, became his undoing. As his boat capsized in the churning waters, he was pulled down into the depths of the Nile, his short and turbulent reign ending in the silent embrace of the river silt. The news of his death reached the palace like a cooling breeze after a long fever. The threat to Cleopatra's life had been extinguished, not by her hand, but by the very river that gave Egypt its life. When Caesar returned to Alexandria, he did not come as a conqueror of the city, but as the restorer of order. The streets that had recently been slick with blood were now cleared for a grand procession. Cleopatra, who had survived the months of confinement with her spirit unbroken, was formally reinstated on the throne of her ancestors. To satisfy the traditionalists and maintain the appearance of continuity, Caesar decreed that she should rule alongside her younger brother, the 11-year-old Ptolemy XIV. But everyone in the city, from the highest priest to the lowliest dockworker, knew where the true power resided. The restoration of the throne was a masterpiece of political theatre. Cleopatra appeared before her people not as a weary survivor, but as a goddess reborn. The Roman military backing was undeniable. Caesar's legions remained stationed in the city, a quiet but firm reminder of the new reality. Yet Cleopatra worked tirelessly to ensure that her reign felt authentically Egyptian. She resumed the ancient rituals, she spoke the language of the people, and she began the long process of repairing the damage the war had wrought upon the city's infrastructure and its soul. The Alexandrian War had been a trial by fire, a period of immense physical danger and psychological pressure that would have broken a lesser individual. For Cleopatra, it was the final stage of her transformation. She had entered the palace as a fugitive, hidden in a laundry bag, and she emerged as the undisputed mistress of the Nile. The consolidation of her power was now complete, but the world beyond the borders of Egypt was still shifting. The bond between the queen and the Roman general had been forged in the heat of battle, and as the smoke cleared from the ruins of the docks, a new era was dawning, one where the destiny of Egypt and the destiny of Rome would become inextricably intertwined, guided by the hand of a woman who had proven she could survive the worst the world could throw at her. The city began to breathe again, the markets reopened, the smell of roasting meats and spices replaced the scent of smoke, and the gentle lap of the waves against the harbour walls returned to its peaceful cadence. In the quiet hours of the evening, as the stars reflected in the calm waters of the Mediterranean, Cleopatra could finally look out over her kingdom and see a future that was hers to command. The shadows of the siege had retreated, leaving behind a queen who was no longer just a player in the Game of Thrones, but the very heart of the empire she was destined to lead into legend. As the night deepened and the palace grew still, The last pharaoh prepared for the long journey ahead, knowing that the peace she had won was merely the beginning of an even greater story. The rhythmic lap of water against a golden hull creates a melody that has echoed through the valley for 3,000 years, a constant, soothing pulse that marks the heartbeat of Egypt itself. In the wake of the Roman Civil War's local conclusion, Cleopatra chooses not a chariot or a fortress to consolidate her power, but a floating palace. This is the beginning of a journey that is as much a religious procession as it is a political tour, a slow and deliberate glide southward against the gentle current of the Nile. Caesar is beside her, the conqueror of the world now captivated by a landscape that feels older than time, and together they board a vessel of such immense proportions and luxury that it seems less like a ship and more like a wandering island of cedar and gold. The barge is a marvel of engineering and craftsmanship, adorned with multi-storied pavilions, lush gardens that smell of crushed mint and jasmine, and private sanctuaries where the air is thick with the scent of expensive Kai-Fi incense. As the oars dip into the silt-rich waters, the Queen of Egypt isn't merely travelling. She is manifesting a new reality for her people. To the peasants working the black soil along the banks and the priests waiting in the shadows of the great pylons, she is no longer just a Hellenistic monarch from a foreign line. She is Isis reborn, the living goddess who ensures the annual flooding of the river and the fertility of the earth. By her side, the Roman general represents a different kind of power, the cold, administrative might of the West. Yet in this context, Cleopatra weaves him into her own divine narrative. As they move deeper into the heart of Upper Egypt, the landscape shifts from the bustling urbanity of Alexandria to the timeless, sun-bleached sandstone of the ancient world. They pass the great pyramids, their limestone casings still shimmering white in the heat of the day, and continue toward the temple complexes of Thebes and Dendera. Everywhere they stop, Cleopatra presents herself with a calculated blend of majesty and accessibility. She speaks the language of the people, a feat none of her predecessors bothered to master, and she performs the ancient rites with a precision that commands the respect of the powerful priesthood. She is showing her subjects that the Roman presence is not an occupation, but a partnership ordained by the gods themselves. During these long, languid weeks on the river, the air between the queen and the general is filled with more than just the politics of state. It is during this voyage that the promise of a Greco-Roman-Egyptian union takes a physical form. Cleopatra is carrying a child, a son who will be named Caesarion, Little Caesar, the ultimate bridge between two worlds. This child is the living embodiment of Cleopatra's strategic genius, a biological guarantee that the future of Rome and the future of Egypt are inextricably linked. In the quiet of the evening, as the barge moors near a cluster of palms and the sound of distant flutes carries over the water, one can imagine the conversations between the two most powerful people in the Mediterranean. They are not just discussing borders and taxes, they are dreaming of an empire that spans the known world, a synthesis of Roman law and Egyptian divinity. This blending of divine kingship with Roman administrative might is a delicate alchemy. Cleopatra understands that for her kingdom to survive the rising tide of Roman expansion, it must become indispensable. She offers Caesar the wealth of the Nile, the grain that feeds the Roman masses, and the gold that pays the legions, but she also offers him something more intangible, the aura of a god-king. In Rome, Caesar is a dictator, a man of the people who must still navigate the treacherous waters of the Senate. But here, under the vast, star-dotted canopy of the Egyptian night, he is treated as a consort to a goddess, a figure of mythic proportions. It is a seductive vision, and Cleopatra uses every resource at her disposal to ensure that Caesar sees the world through an Egyptian lens. The voyage is a slow-motion pageant of power, a series of days where the boundary between the mortal and the divine begins to blur. They visit the temple of Hathor at Dendera, where Cleopatra's image is carved into the very stone of the exterior walls, standing tall and eternal. She ensures that Caesar witnesses the devotion of the crowds, the way the people fall to their knees as the royal barge passes. She is teaching him that while Rome may have the swords, Egypt has the soul, the history, and the sacred legitimacy that a new empire requires. The union of their houses is not just a romantic entanglement. It is a grand architectural design for a new world order, one where the Mediterranean is a Roman lake, but the heart of that lake beats with the ancient wisdom of the pharaohs. As the ship glides past the colossal statues of past kings, their stone eyes staring out into the desert, the sheer scale of Egyptian history serves as a backdrop to Cleopatra's ambition. She is the heir to 3,000 years of tradition, and she carries that weight with a grace that Caesar finds intoxicating. The birth of Caesarion becomes the focal point of her long-term strategy. With a son who is the direct heir to Caesar, the Queen of Egypt secures a claim to the Roman leadership that no other client monarch could dream of. She is playing a game of generational stakes, looking decades into the future toward a time when her son might sit upon a throne that unites East and West in a way the world has never seen. The journey eventually turns back toward Alexandria, the current now aiding their return. But the world has fundamentally changed during their time on the river. The alliance is sealed not just by treaties signed in ink, but by the shared experience of the Nile's timeless beauty and the promise of a new dynasty. Cleopatra has successfully navigated the most dangerous period of her reign, transforming a position of vulnerability into one of unprecedented influence. She has made herself the indispensable partner of the most powerful man in Rome, and in doing so, she has ensured that Egypt remains the jewel of the ancient world. The water continues to flow, a silent witness to the whispered plans and the grand visions of a queen who refused to be a footnote in history. As Alexandria reappears on the horizon, its great lighthouse standing as a beacon of civilization, Cleopatra knows that the voyage was only the beginning. The seeds of a Greco-Roman-Egyptian union have been sown in the fertile mud of the Nile, and as she prepares to return to her capital, she does so with the knowledge that she has redefined the very nature of power. The last pharaoh has not just survived, she has ascended, and the echoes of her journey will resonate through the halls of Rome and the temples of Egypt for centuries to come. The nights on the river may be ending, but the story of Cleopatra's reign is entering its most luminous chapter, a time of shadows and sunlight, where every move is a masterstroke in the eternal game of empires. The scent of crushed mint and expensive oils follows Cleopatra as she steps onto the marble docks of the Tiber, a sensory bridge between the ancient sands of Egypt and the rising stone of Rome. She does not arrive as a supplicant or a mere guest, but as a sovereign, a living goddess whose presence demands a reorganization of the Roman world. As she settles into her residency at Caesar's sprawling gardens on the Transtiberim, the city feels the shift in its own gravity. The quiet suburban air across the river is suddenly thick with the politics of two worlds colliding. From the terrace of Caesar's villa, she can see the heart of the Republic, but she remains physically separated by the water, a symbolic distance that highlights her status as both an insider and a profound, unsettling outsider. This is a residence of immense beauty, where the lush greenery of the Roman hillside is groomed to meet the exacting standards of a queen who is used to the botanical wonders of Alexandria. Here, the nights are cool, and the sound of the wind through the cypress trees provides a soft, rhythmic backdrop to the quiet plotting of a woman who knows that her every breath is being monitored by the most powerful men in the world. The impact of her arrival ripples through the Roman streets like a stone cast into a still pond, and soon the very fabric of Roman life begins to change under the weight of Egyptian influence. It is not merely a matter of politics, It is a cultural transformation that seeps into the homes of the elite and the markets of the common people. Roman women, long accustomed to the severe and modest traditions of their ancestors, find themselves mesmerized by the queen's kohl-rimmed eyes and the intricate flowing silks that seem to defy the rigid structure of the Roman stola. Suddenly, the aesthetic of the Nile is everywhere. Gold jewelry, fashioned into the shape of serpents, winds around Roman wrists, and the scent of exotic spices, once rare and prohibitively expensive, becomes the hallmark of a fashionable household. Even the intellectual landscape of the city begins to tilt toward the east. Caesar, ever the pragmatist, recognizes that the Egyptian calendar, governed by the predictable cycles of the sun rather than the erratic whims of the moon, is a superior tool for governing a vast empire. And so, with Cleopatra's scholars whispering the secrets of the stars into the ears of Roman officials, the Julian calendar is born, a legacy of Egyptian science that will outlast the Republic itself. Yet beneath this veneer of cultural fascination, a dark and bitter resentment begins to fester within the walls of the Roman Senate. To the traditionalists, the men who pride themselves on the stern virtues of the Republic, Cleopatra is more than just a foreign monarch. She is a symbol of everything they fear. They see in her the spectre of Rex, the ancient word for king that carries a poison for any Roman ear. But in her case, it is even more complex, for she represents a power that is absolute, divine, and unapologetically feminine. As she holds court in Caesar's gardens, receiving senators and generals as if they were her own subjects, the air in the Curia grows cold with indignation. They whisper of her Eastern decadence, a term they use to mask their discomfort with her intelligence and her undeniable influence over Caesar. To them, the sight of a golden statue of Cleopatra placed within the temple of Venus Genetrix is not just a gesture of Caesar's affection, but a sacrilegious affront to the Roman gods, a sign that the boundaries between the human and the divine, the Roman and the foreigner, are being erased. Navigating these dangerous undercurrents requires a strategic genius that goes far beyond the charms of the bedroom. Cleopatra moves through the Roman social circles with the grace of a predator in a garden of statues, aware that every smile she offers is being weighed against the survival of her kingdom. She understands the fragile ego of the Roman man, the way they value the appearance of dignity even as they scramble for scraps of power. She hosts banquets that are masterpieces of diplomacy, where the wine flows as freely as the conversation, yet she never loses her footing. She is a polyglot in a city that often speaks only the language of force, and she uses her mastery of rhetoric to charm the very men who plot her downfall in the shadows of the Forum. There is a quiet, measured pace to her days in Rome, a morning spent discussing philosophy with the city's brightest minds, an afternoon reviewing the trade reports from Alexandria, and an evening spent in the company of Caesar, reinforcing the bond that keeps Egypt sovereign and her son, Caesarion, safe. The Roman Republic is a place of shifting sands, a system of government that is slowly collapsing under its own weight, and Cleopatra is perhaps the most astute observer of its decay. She watches as the rivalries between the great families turn into blood feuds, and she realizes that the stability of her own throne is inextricably linked to the stability of Caesar's position. She is walking a tightrope over a chasm of historical change. On one side is the dream of a Mediterranean empire ruled by a divine couple, and on the other is the reality of a city that murdered its kings and is wary of anyone who dares to wear a crown. The resentment of the Senate is not just a personal grudge against her, it is a desperate, gasping defense of an old world that is being replaced by something new and unfamiliar. They see her as the enchantress who has clouded the mind of their greatest general, failing to realize that she is his intellectual equal, a partner in the grand design of a world where Rome and Alexandria are the two pillars of civilization. As the seasons turn and the Roman heat begins to settle over the Tiber, the queen remains a figure of mystery and controversy, a woman who has brought the light of the East to the marble halls of the West. She spends her hours in the cool shade of the garden porticos, perhaps listening to the distant roar of the city and reflecting on the vast distance she has travelled. The sounds of Rome are different from the sounds of Alexandria. There is a certain harshness to the Latin tongue, a clatter of iron on stone that lacks the melodic softness of the Nile's reeds. Yet she adapts. She learns the nuances of Roman law and the intricacies of their social hierarchies, using this knowledge to protect her interests with a precision that leaves her enemies frustrated and confused. She is not merely waiting for Caesar to act. She is actively shaping the environment in which he moves, ensuring that the interests of Egypt are never far from his mind. The nights in the gardens are long and filled with the scent of blooming roses and the faint metallic tang of the river. It is in these quiet moments, away from the prying eyes of the spies and the sycophants, that the weight of her ambition is most palpable. She is a mother, a queen, and a goddess, carrying the hopes of a 3,000-year-old civilization on her shoulders as she negotiates with a city that is still, in many ways, in its infancy. The Romans pride themselves on their gravity, their gravitas, but Cleopatra possesses a different kind of weight, a historical depth that makes the Roman senators seem like children playing in the ruins of a future they cannot yet see. She knows that her presence in Rome is a gamble of the highest stakes, a move that could either secure her dynasty for 1,000 years or lead to a cataclysm that will consume everyone she loves. And so, she continues to navigate the labyrinth of the Roman Republic with a calm and measured step. She ignores the insults whispered in the hallways and the cold stares of the Roman matrons, focusing instead on the long game of empire. She understands that power is not just about armies and gold, but about the stories people tell and the images they hold in their minds. By bringing the splendor of Egypt to the heart of Rome, she is rewriting the story of the world, positioning herself not as a conquered subject, but as a co-architect of the future. The cultural impact of her stay is a slow-acting medicine, or perhaps a slow-acting poison, depending on who one asks. But it is undeniable. The Rome she will eventually leave will not be the same Rome she entered. It will be a city that has tasted the luxury of the East and glimpsed the possibilities of a world where a single, divinely sanctioned will can bring order to the chaos of the masses. As the stars drift slowly across the Italian sky, mirroring the constellations that watch over the temples of Karnak and Philae, the Queen of Egypt sits in the silence of her Roman villa. The air is still, and the world seems to hold its breath, caught between the old ways and the new. She is the bridge between these two worlds, a figure of light and shadow who understands that in the game of empires, the most powerful weapon is not the sword, but the mind. The resentment of the Senate may grow, the whispers may turn into plots, and the very ground beneath her feet may tremble, but Cleopatra remains unmoved, a sovereign of the soul who knows that even in the heart of her enemy's city, she is the one who truly wears the crown. The eternal city is vast, stretching far beyond the horizon in its ambition, but it has finally met a spirit as vast as its own, a woman who will leave an indelible mark on its stones and its stories, long after the gardens have faded and the river has carried the memories of this summer into the sea. The sharp, metallic scent of blood and the sudden, jarring silence of the Roman Senate house would soon ripple outward like a stone cast into a still pond, shattering the fragile peace Cleopatra had found within her villa across the Tiber. On the 15th of March, in the year 44 before the Common Era, the world shifted on its axis. Julius Caesar, the man who had reshaped the Mediterranean and held the hand of the Queen of Egypt, lay still upon the cold marble floor, and with his final breath, the safety of Cleopatra and her young son, Caesarion, evaporated into the humid Roman air. The news likely reached her not as a roar, but as a frantic whisper through the corridors of her estate, a sudden chilling of the atmosphere that told her the game had changed irrevocably. In an instant, she was no longer the honored guest of the most powerful man in the world. She was a foreign queen in a city that had just murdered its own master, a living reminder of the kingly ambitions that the conspirators sought to extinguish. The golden atmosphere of the Roman gardens turned grey and heavy with the threat of violence. Her strategic mind, always moving several steps ahead of her peers, would have immediately grasped the gravity of the situation. There was no time for mourning, no space for the luxury of grief. The streets of Rome were beginning to boil with confusion and rage, and the very soldiers who had stood guard over her could, at any moment, become her captors or her executioners. And so, with the quiet precision of a shadow fleeing the dawn, Cleopatra began to orchestrate her departure. She did not panic, nor did she wait for the dust to settle or for an invitation to leave. She understood that her power lay not in the marble halls of Rome, but in the silt and the sun of the Nile. Her primary duty was to the small child who carried the blood of both Rome and Egypt in his veins, the boy she envisioned as the bridge between two worlds. To stay was to risk becoming a pawn in the bloody civil war that was surely coming. To leave was to preserve the future of her dynasty. The journey back across the sea was a somber one, the oars of her galley rhythmically slicing through the Mediterranean waves as she watched the Italian coastline fade into a thin, dark line. The voyage allowed her time to think, to breathe, and to recalibrate her vision for Egypt. As the salt spray settled on her skin, she must have felt the immense weight of the vacuum Caesar had left behind. Rome was a hydra now, its many heads snapping at one another in a desperate scramble for control. There was Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal general, a man of passion and fire. There was Octavian, the young and untested grandnephew named as Caesar's heir. And there were the conspirators, Brutus and Cassius, fleeing to the east to gather their legions. Cleopatra watched from afar as this new power vacuum began to pull the world into its depths. She knew that the rise of what would become the second triumvirate, the uneasy alliance between Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus, was merely a temporary lid on a boiling cauldron. But while Rome descended into the chaos of proscriptions and political purges, Cleopatra returned to Alexandria not as a refugee, but as a savior. She returned to a land that needed her steady hand, for even as the Roman world burned, the cycles of the Nile continued, indifferent to the deaths of dictators. Upon her arrival, she found an Egypt that was struggling with the echoes of famine and the exhaustion of previous years of strife. Her first task was the stabilization of the Egyptian economy, a feat she accomplished with a mastery of administration that often goes unmentioned in the grand tragedies written about her life. She was a queen who understood the power of grain as much as the power of gold. While the Roman generals were debasing their currency to pay for their sprawling armies, Cleopatra worked to ensure that the internal markets of Egypt remained resilient. She managed the royal granaries with meticulous care, ensuring that even when the floods were less than ideal, her people did not starve. She was the living personification of Isis, the provider, and by securing the physical well-being of her subjects, she secured their absolute loyalty. She also took the decisive step of naming Caesarion as her co-ruler, officially elevating the 3-year-old boy to the status of Ptolemy XV. In doing so, she sent a clear message to the world. The line of Caesar lived on in Egypt, and it was a line that wore the double crown of the pharaohs. This was not merely a mother's pride, but a calculated political maneuver. It gave her regime a legitimacy that the warring factions in Rome could not ignore. She was positioning Egypt as a stable, wealthy, and sovereign sanctuary amidst a sea of Roman instability. As the months stretched into years, the Roman chaos deepened. The second triumvirate was formed in a pact of blood and necessity, and the world was carved into spheres of influence. Cleopatra remained in her palace by the sea, watching the horizon, receiving reports from her spies and diplomats. She saw how the Roman economy was faltering under the weight of civil war, how the fields of Italy lay fallow, while the men who should have tended them were marching toward the battlefield of Philippi. In contrast, Alexandria flourished. The great library continued to be a beacon of knowledge. The lighthouse still guided ships from every corner of the known world into her harbour, and the royal mints produced coins that held their value when others crumbled. She was playing a long game, a game of patience and observation. She knew that eventually one of the Roman titans would emerge from the smoke and look toward the east. They would look toward Egypt, not just for its beauty or its history, but for its wealth. Egypt was the breadbasket of the Mediterranean, the only treasury deep enough to fund the ambitions of a world empire. Cleopatra ensured that when that moment came, she would be meeting them from a position of strength. She was not a victim of Roman history, but its most astute observer, waiting for the perfect moment to step back onto the stage. The atmosphere in Alexandria during these years was one of a quiet, focused rebuilding. Imagine the queen walking through the cool, shadowed halls of her palace, the air smelling of frankincense and the salty tang of the Mediterranean. She would spend her mornings with her financiers and her afternoons with her scholars, her mind a tireless engine of statecraft. She was refining the machinery of her kingdom, tightening the tax codes, overseeing the irrigation projects that were the lifeblood of the Delta, and ensuring that the Greek and Egyptian populations under her rule felt a shared sense of prosperity. Meanwhile, the Roman world was tearing itself apart at the seams. The news of the Battle of Philippi eventually reached her, the word of Brutus and Cassius's defeat and the definitive end of the old republic. The triumvirs had won, but their victory was a hollow one, for the world was now divided between them. Mark Antony had taken the east, and Octavian had taken the west. It was only a matter of time before the gaze of Antony fell upon the wealthiest prize in his new domain. Cleopatra understood the psychology of these men better than they understood themselves. She knew that Antony was a man who lived in the grand gesture, a man who craved the spectacular and the divine. He was not the cold, calculating Caesar, but a soldier of passion. As she prepared for their eventual meeting, she did not prepare for war. She prepared for a performance. She was stabilizing her economy, not just for her people, but to provide the stage for a diplomatic encounter that would change the course of history once again. The Roman chaos was, in many ways, Cleopatra's greatest opportunity. In the absence of a single, central Roman authority, she was able to assert Egyptian sovereignty in ways her ancestors had not dared for generations. She was the most stable element in a volatile world, a fixed star around which the wandering planets of Roman ambition were beginning to orbit. Her strategic retreat to Alexandria had not been an act of flight, but a tactical repositioning. She had returned to the source of her power to wait for the storm to blow itself out, knowing that when the clouds finally parted, she would be the one standing in the light. The stabilization of Egypt was her silent triumph. While the Roman Forum echoed with the cries of the proscribed and the clatter of arms, the markets of Alexandria hummed with the sound of trade. The papyrus reeds grew thick along the riverbanks, and the caravans moved steadily across the desert sands, bringing spices and silks to her feet. She had turned an empire in crisis into a fortress of culture and commerce. She was the last pharaoh, yes, but she was also a modern ruler who understood that the true foundation of a throne was a full treasury and a fed populace. As the years of the Second Triumvirate's early reign passed, the tension between the East and the West began to solidify. The world was holding its breath, sensing that the peace between Antony and Octavian was a thin veneer over a deep-seated rivalry. Cleopatra, in her wisdom, did not rush to pick a side. She made herself indispensable to the idea of the East. She made Egypt the heart of the world again, a place where the ancient mysteries of the gods met the practical realities of a global economy. She must have spent many evenings on her balcony, looking out over the great harbour, watching the lanterns of the ships bobbing on the water like fallen stars. The memory of Caesar remained, perhaps, as a soft ache or a lesson learned, but her eyes were fixed on the future. She knew that the next chapter of her story would require even more of her than the last. It would require a blend of the divine and the terrestrial, a marriage of Egyptian splendor and Roman might. And as the Roman world continued its slow, violent metamorphosis, the Queen of Kings sat in her garden, listening to the gentle lap of the waves against the quay, perfectly still, perfectly prepared, and infinitely patient. The scent of expensive incense usually begins as a thin, silver ribbon of smoke, but on the banks of the Cydnus River in the year 41 before the Common Era, it was a heavy, intoxicating fog that announced a goddess before she could even be seen. Mark Antony, the Roman triumvir who now held the keys to the Eastern world, sat on his tribunal in the city square of Tarsus, waiting for the Queen of Egypt to answer his summons. He expected a vassal, perhaps a nervous monarch, coming to explain her neutrality during the recent Roman civil wars. But as the crowds began to thin in the marketplace, drawn toward the river by a sound that was less like a march and more like a lullaby, Antony found himself sitting in a suddenly empty square. The sound drifting over the water was the low, rhythmic hum of silver oars dipping into the river, timed perfectly to the breathy notes of flutes and the delicate plucking of harps. As the vessel rounded the bend, it appeared not as a ship of war, but as a floating palace of gold. The hull shimmered with gilded leaf, catching the afternoon light and casting ripples of amber across the muddy riverbanks. Above, the sails were not the utilitarian linen of the Roman navy, but great expanses of Tyrian purple silk, so heavy with dye that they seemed to move with a slow liquid grace even when the breeze was faint. Cleopatra did not arrive with the clatter of iron or the shouting of sailors. She arrived as a sensory experience, a carefully orchestrated vision designed to overwhelm the Roman mind before a single word was even exchanged. Under a canopy of gold cloth, the queen reclined, dressed in the gossamer robes of Aphrodite. She was surrounded by beautiful boys dressed as cupids who fanned her with a gentle, hypnotic rhythm, while her handmaidens, costumed as sea nymphs and graces, tended the silken rigging. To the people of Tarsus, and to Antony himself, this was not merely a diplomatic meeting. It was the epiphany of a goddess. Cleopatra knew that Antony was a man of vast appetites, a soldier who loved the theatre of life, and she gave him a spectacle that made the rigid dignity of Rome seem grey and lifeless by comparison. She did not go to him. She waited for him to come to her. When he sent an invitation for her to dine with him, she declined with a practised, elegant poise, suggesting instead that it would be more fitting for him to be her guest. And so, the Roman general stepped onto the golden barge, leaving behind the dust of the city for a world of soft light and unimaginable luxury. The decks were covered in a carpet of rose petals, inches deep, muffling the sound of his boots and filling the air with a sweet, wilting fragrance that signaled the end of the old world and the beginning of something new. The lighting was a masterpiece of engineering, with thousands of lamps suspended in intricate patterns, creating a glow that seemed to emanate from the very air itself. Antony, who had spent his life in the harsh glare of the sun or the flickering shadows of a campfire, was utterly captivated. Cleopatra had understood his psychology perfectly. She did not appeal to his logic or his political fears, but to his senses and his vanity. She spoke to him in his own tongue, but with the melodic cadence of a woman who mastered languages as easily as she mastered men. She was witty, irreverent, and possessed a brilliance that made the conversation flow like the wine they drank from jeweled cups. This was the beginning of a partnership that was as much about lifestyle as it was about power. Together they formed a society they called the Inimitable Livers, a group of inner-circle friends who dedicated themselves to the art of the present moment. They lived with a deliberate high-stakes decadence, hosting banquets that cost fortunes and engaging in midnight escapades through the streets of Alexandria, often disguised as commoners to see how the other half lived. In these quiet, indulgent hours, the weight of the crown and the sword seemed to lift. They were no longer just the Queen of Egypt and the Master of the East. They were two individuals who had found in each other a mirror for their own grand ambitions and their own deep-seated loneliness. The Inimitable Livers was more than just a club for the wealthy. It was a sanctuary of shared experience. They spent their days hunting, fishing, and gambling, and their nights in philosophical debates that lasted until the stars began to pale in the morning sky. Cleopatra was his constant companion, his drinking partner, his strategist, and his muse. She played at dice with him, drank with him, and went hunting with him, ensuring that she was never far from his thoughts or his side. This was the strategic genius of the last pharaoh. She realized that in the Roman world, power was often a cold and transactional thing, built on duty and the grim necessity of the state. By contrast, she offered Antony a world of color, warmth, and intellectual vitality. She made herself indispensable by becoming the source of his joy. As they reclined on silken cushions, watching the moonlight dance on the Mediterranean, the political alliances were being forged not in the cold marble of the Senate, but in the soft amber glow of a shared life. The Roman world was shifting on its axis, moving away from the austere traditions of the Republic toward a future that looked remarkably like the ancient, gilded courts of the East. Meanwhile, the ripples of their union began to spread across the sea, reaching the ears of Octavian in Rome. But for a time, within the palace walls of Alexandria, those concerns felt like distant thunder on a clear summer day. Cleopatra had secured her kingdom once again, not with an army of thousands, but with the scent of roses, the sound of a silver flute, and the quiet, unwavering power of a woman who knew exactly how to make a man feel like a god. She watched the smoke from the incense burners curl toward the ceiling, satisfied that the barge at Tarsus had carried her exactly where she needed to go, into the very heart of the Roman Empire's most powerful man. As the nights grew long and the wine continued to flow, the legend of the Inimitable Livers grew, becoming a symbol of an era that dared to live with an intensity that few could imagine. It was a lifestyle of beautiful defiance, a way of saying that even in the shadow of history, one could find a way to live with a brilliance that would never be forgotten. And as Cleopatra closed her eyes in the quiet of the Egyptian night, she knew that the game was far from over. But for now the world was exactly as she had designed it, golden, fragrant, and entirely within her reach. The scent of expensive incense, a blend of chi-fi and cedarwood, drifted through the open colonnades of the gymnasium in Alexandria, where the air was thick with the anticipation of a world being remade. It was the autumn of the year 34 before the Common Era, and the city was draped in the richest purples and the most luminous golds, a visual symphony designed to announce the dawn of a new age. Cleopatra did not merely occupy her throne, she inhabited it as a living manifestation of a cosmic order that she had carefully, brilliantly reconstructed through years of diplomatic maneuvering and economic foresight. On this day, seated upon a throne of solid silver beside Mark Antony, she wore the robes of the goddess Isis, her presence a shimmering bridge between the mortal and the divine. The crowd below was a sea of faces, thousands of citizens gathered to witness an event that history would come to call the Donations of Alexandria, a moment when the geography of the known world was redrawn with the stroke of a queen's pen and the weight of her ambition. Beside her sat Antony, dressed as the god Dionysus, his presence lending the Roman seal of approval to a vision that was entirely Egyptian in its soul. Together, they looked out over their children, the heirs to a legacy that spanned continents. There was young Caesarion, whom Cleopatra had declared the true son and heir of Julius Caesar, standing as the King of Kings, a title that echoed the ancient majesty of the pharaohs and the Persian emperors of old. Then there were her children with Antony, the twins Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selina, and the young Ptolemy Philadelphus. As the proclamations were read, the very earth seemed to shift beneath the feet of the Roman legates who watched in stunned silence. Cleopatra was not merely securing her own borders, she was distributing the vast territories of the East, Armenia, Media, Parthia, Cyrenaica, and the lush lands of Syria and Cilicia, to her children. It was a grand, sweeping vision of a unified Eastern Empire, a Mediterranean world where Alexandria, not Rome, served as the true cultural and political heartbeat of civilization. As the sun caught the glint of the jewels in her crown, Cleopatra's mind was likely far beyond the immediate spectacle of the crowd. She was a woman who understood the intricate mechanics of power, knowing that an empire is built not just on grand gestures, but on the silent, steady flow of grain and gold. While Rome was perpetually fractured by civil unrest, rising bread prices, and the grueling demands of its military machine, Egypt remained a sanctuary of calculated abundance. Cleopatra had instituted administrative reforms that were as quiet as they were revolutionary. She had refined the tax systems, ensuring that the wealth of the Nile's annual inundation was managed with a precision that favored both the crown and the stability of the peasantry. She moved through the ledgers of her kingdom with the same grace she used to navigate the halls of her palace, understanding that a well-fed populace is a loyal one. Under her rule, the Egyptian economy became a masterpiece of ancient logistics, allowing her to fund her grand ambitions without the desperate thievery that often characterized Roman provincial administration. The world she was building was one of synthesis, a beautiful blending of Greek intellect and Egyptian mysticism. She saw herself as the new Isis, the mother of the land and the protector of its people, a deity who brought order to the chaos of the shifting desert sands. By adopting this religious iconography, she was speaking a language that every person in her kingdom understood, from the lowliest farmer in the Delta to the most sophisticated philosopher in the library. Isis was the goddess of 10,000 names, the one who gathered the scattered pieces of the past to create a whole and vibrant present. In the same way, Cleopatra gathered the fragments of the old Ptolemaic Empire and the dreams of Alexander the Great, weaving them into a new tapestry that felt both ancient and inevitable. Beside her, Antony's identification with Dionysus, the god of wine, theatre, and the ecstatic release of the spirit, complemented her perfectly. To the people of the East, they were not merely rulers. They were the embodiment of the joy of life and the eternal cycle of rebirth. They were the inimitable livers on a grand celestial scale, inviting their subjects to believe in a world where the divine and the human were inextricably linked. This vision of a vast Eastern Empire was more than a vanity project. It was a strategic masterpiece designed to insulate Egypt from the encroaching shadows of Roman expansion. Cleopatra knew that Rome was a predator that respected only strength and utility. By positioning Alexandria as the center of a network of client kingdoms, all ruled by her own bloodline, she was creating a buffer of loyalty that stretched from the mountains of Armenia to the shores of North Africa. She was playing a game of three-dimensional chess while her rivals in Rome were still arguing over the rules of the board. As the years passed, the wealth of Egypt continued to grow, fueled by trade routes that reached as far as India and the mysterious lands of the south. Cleopatra's ships brought spices, silks, and exotic animals to her docks, making Alexandria the most cosmopolitan city the world had ever seen. It was a place where ideas were traded as freely as emeralds, and where the queen herself was the ultimate patron of every art and science. In the quiet hours of the night, when the celebrations of the donations had faded into the rhythmic lapping of the Mediterranean against the palace walls, one can imagine Cleopatra walking through her private gardens. The air would be cool, scented with the night-blooming jasmine and the salt spray of the sea. She had achieved what no other woman of her time had dared to imagine. She had turned a crumbling dynasty into the most powerful force in the East. She had secured the future of her children and placed them on thrones that overlooked the cradle of civilization. She was the architect of a new world order, a queen who understood that the true secret of reign was not just in the holding of land, but in the capturing of the imagination. The administrative brilliance she displayed during this period is often overshadowed by the drama of her romances, yet it was her steady hand on the rudder of the state that allowed those romances to flourish. She managed the monopolies on papyrus and oil with a shrewdness that would have made a modern merchant prince envious, ensuring that the royal treasury was always overflowing. This wealth was her greatest weapon, more powerful than any legion. It allowed her to build a navy that was the envy of the world and to keep her people prosperous while the rest of the Mediterranean struggled with the various hungers of war. She was a philosopher queen who knew that the belly must be full before the mind can contemplate the divine, and so, as the stars turned over the great library, and the Pharos lighthouse cast its guiding beam across the dark waters, Cleopatra's empire felt eternal. It was a realm of light and logic, of passion and precision. The religious festivals she presided over were not just displays of piety, but communal celebrations of a shared identity. When she appeared as the new Isis, she was telling her people that they were protected, that the Nile would always rise, and that the glory of Egypt would never fade. She had transformed herself into a symbol that was larger than life, a figure who could not be easily erased from the pages of time. Meanwhile, across the sea, the reports of the donations were reaching the ears of Octavian, and the tension between East and West was beginning to tighten, like a harp string stretched to its breaking point. But in Alexandria, the music was still playing. The wine was still flowing from the jars of the new Dionysus, and the Queen of Kings sat in her garden, listening to the wind in the palms. She had built a world of beauty and order, a sanctuary for the spirit in an age of iron. It was a moment of perfect, golden equilibrium, where the dream of an empire was as real as the stone of the pyramids, and as enduring as the river that gave them life. Cleopatra knew that the shadows were lengthening, but for now she reigned supreme, a woman who had mastered the art of living and the science of power, weaving them together into a legacy that would haunt the dreams of emperors for 1,000 years to come. In the quiet halls of the Roman Senate, the air grew heavy with the scent of old parchment and the sharp, metallic tang of political ambition. While the Nile continued its ancient, rhythmic pulse, a different kind of storm was gathering across the Mediterranean, a storm not of wind and rain, but of words and whispers. Octavian, the young and calculating heir of Caesar, understood that to defeat an enemy like Cleopatra, one did not merely need legions and ships, one needed to dismantle the very idea of her. And so, the ink began to flow in Rome, thick and poisonous, as a sophisticated smear campaign took root in the hearts of the Roman people. Octavian was a master of the narrative, a weaver of public perception who knew that the Roman soul was deeply rooted in a specific kind of stern, stoic virtue. To the Romans, Cleopatra was not a sovereign queen or a brilliant diplomat. She was painted instead as a foreign enchantress, a dangerous Eastern other who used dark seductions to unravel the discipline of Rome's greatest generals. The whispers turned into speeches, and the speeches into decree. She was depicted as a siren from the edges of the known world, a woman whose very presence was an affront to the traditional Roman way of life. The propaganda was relentless and calculated. It did not target Mark Antony directly at first, for he was still a Roman hero with many friends in the city, but rather focused on the idea that he had been bewitched, his Roman spirit hollowed out by the decadent luxuries of the Egyptian court. Octavian's poets and orators spoke of golden couches and pearl-dissolving banquets, framing these moments of cultural fusion as evidence of a moral rot. They spoke of Cleopatra as a threat to the sanctity of the Roman family, a queen who dared to stand as an equal to men, wielding power that the Roman Senate believed should belong only to them. In this narrative, she was the fatale monstrum, the fatal monster, a creature of mythic danger whose ambition knew no bounds. Cleopatra, however, was not a passive observer to this character assassination. She understood the power of the image just as well as her rival in Rome. In the bustling markets of Alexandria and the quiet temples of Upper Egypt, she struck back with the tools of her own sovereignty. She commissioned the minting of coins that told a different story, a story of partnership and divine right. On these small circles of silver and bronze, her profile appeared strong and determined, often paired with the image of Antony, presenting them not as a scandalous pair of lovers, but as a unified political front, the dual rulers of a new Hellenistic world. As the years passed, the landscape of the empire became a battlefield of symbols. In the cities of the East, statues were raised that depicted Cleopatra as Isis, the mother goddess, the restorer of order and the bringer of life. She was shown in the traditional Egyptian style, serene and eternal, a protector of her people, whose authority was granted by the gods themselves. Every statue, every public inscription, was a calculated move in a grand game of chess played across 3 continents. She was fighting for the hearts and minds of her subjects, ensuring that they saw her not as the villain of a Roman tragedy, but as the rightful heir to the legacy of Alexander the Great and the ancient pharaohs. Meanwhile, back in the shadowed porticos of Rome, Octavian continued to tighten the noose. He utilized the most modern technology of his day, the wide distribution of pamphlets and the public reading of forged or exaggerated documents, to convince the populace that Cleopatra intended to move the capital of the empire from Rome to Alexandria. The thought of the Tiber being eclipsed by the Nile sent shivers through the Roman aristocracy. It was a clever psychological ploy, turning a political rivalry into an existential threat to the Roman identity. The tension in the air was palpable, a low hum of anxiety that stretched from the 7 hills to the delta of the Nile. The strategic use of her public image was Cleopatra's primary defense against this rising tide of Roman xenophobia. She knew that to the Greeks she must be the philosopher queen, a patron of the arts and the sciences, who spoke a dozen languages and understood the intricacies of Stoic thought. To the Egyptians she must be the living embodiment of the divine, the one who ensured the annual flooding of the river and the fertility of the soil. To Antony, she was the partner in a dream of an Eastern empire that would rival the glory of the past. She wore these different masks with a fluid grace, a chameleon of power who understood that truth was often less important than perception. As the decade wore on, the diplomatic channels began to fray and snap. The letters between the leaders grew shorter, colder, and more filled with veiled threats. The world was being carved into 2 distinct spheres, the cold, disciplined west of Octavian and the lush, cosmopolitan east of Antony and Cleopatra. It was a divide that could not be bridged by treaties or marriages. The escalating tensions were like the slow tightening of a bowstring, a pressure that built until it became unbearable. Every move Octavian made in the Senate was met by a counter-move in the court of Alexandria, a constant back and forth that felt like the gathering of clouds before a great summer storm. The inevitable naval conflict began to loom over the horizon, a ghost ship sailing toward the present. Cleopatra was well aware that her wealth and her fleet were her greatest assets, but she also knew that Octavian had the momentum of a unified Rome behind him. She began to oversee the construction of massive warships, galleys with multiple banks of oars that looked like great sea monsters resting in the harbor of Alexandria. The sound of hammers and saws echoed through the shipyards, a rhythmic pounding that matched the heartbeat of a queen who knew that the time for words was ending and the time for iron was beginning. The propaganda war had done its work. It had stripped away the complexities of the political situation and replaced them with a simple, terrifying story of a foreign queen bent on the destruction of Rome. It was a narrative that Octavian used to justify the unthinkable, a civil war framed as a foreign crusade. By declaring war on Cleopatra alone, rather than on Antony, Octavian cleverly avoided the stigma of fighting a fellow Roman, casting himself instead as the defender of the Republic against an alien threat. It was a masterstroke of political theatre, a final tightening of the knot. And so the stage was set for the final act. The golden equilibrium of the previous years began to tilt, the weight of Roman ambition pulling the world toward a violent resolution. Cleopatra, sitting in her palace by the sea, could perhaps hear the distant sound of the Roman trumpets, a low, ominous vibration across the water. She had spent a lifetime mastering the art of the possible, navigating the treacherous waters of power with a brilliant and strategic mind. Now she would have to face a challenge that could not be solved with a smile, a coin, or a clever turn of phrase. The air in Alexandria grew still, that heavy, expectant silence that precedes the breaking of the monsoon. The scrolls were packed, the gold was counted, and the ships were readied. The queen looked out over the Mediterranean, the sea that had brought her Caesar, that had brought her Antony, and that would now bring her the end of her world. The propaganda had turned her into a legend before her time, a figure of myth and shadow, but as she prepared for the coming conflict, she remained a woman of flesh and blood, a strategist who knew that even if she lost the war of ships, she had already won the war of history. Her image would endure, carved into the stone of temples and etched into the memory of her enemies. Octavian could take her kingdom, he could take her life, but he could never truly take her story. It was a story written in the stars and the sand, a narrative of a woman who dared to dream of a world where the East and the West could meet in a golden embrace. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long purple shadows over the harbour, the Queen of Kings remained resolute, a solitary figure of immense dignity standing on the precipice of an uncertain future. The world was waiting, breathless and cold, for the first clash of oars and the first flight of arrows. The propaganda had reached its fever pitch, the lies and the truths so intertwined that they could never be fully separated again. But in the quiet of the night, away from the noise of the Senate and the clamour of the docks, the truth remained. A queen who loved her country, a mother who feared for her children, and a ruler who understood that the greatest power of all was the power to be remembered. And as the dark waters of the Mediterranean lapped against the stone piers of Alexandria, the reign of the last Pharaoh prepared to meet the judgment of the tides. The salt air of the Ionian Sea carries a heavy, expectant stillness, the kind of silence that precedes a summer storm. For months, the waters off the coast of western Greece have been crowded with the silhouettes of hundreds of ships, their masts swaying gently like a forest of cedar and pine. This is not the Alexandria of marble palaces and scented gardens, but a world of creaking timber, the rhythmic splash of oars, and the metallic scent of bronze armour heating under a relentless sun. Cleopatra sits beneath a canopy on her massive flagship, the Antonius, watching the horizon where Octavian's fleet waits, a line of predatory shadows against the blue. The build-up to this moment has been a slow, agonizing chess match of logistics and nerves. Cleopatra's presence here is not merely symbolic, She has provided the bulk of the funding, the grain to feed the legions, and a significant portion of the naval strength. Her ships are magnificent, towering structures built for intimidation, their hulls reinforced with massive beams of wood, designed to crush smaller vessels. Yet, as the standoff stretches through the long, humid weeks of late summer in the year 31 before Common Era, the atmosphere within the camp at Actium begins to sour. Disease ripples through the crowded tents on shore, and the supply lines, once so robust, are being strangled by the tactical brilliance of Octavian's admiral Agrippa. In the quiet hours of the evening, inside the command tent, the air is thick with the smell of lamp oil and the low murmur of desperate men. Antony is a shadow of the general he once was, caught between the conflicting advice of his Roman officers and his unwavering commitment to the Queen of Egypt. Many of his generals urge him to abandon the sea and march inland to settle the matter on the dusty plains of Macedonia, where his legions might still hold the advantage. But Cleopatra understands a truth that the Roman soldiers cannot see. To abandon the fleet is to abandon the sea lanes to Egypt. If they lose the water, they are trapped, and Alexandria would be left defenseless against a Roman tide. She insists on a naval engagement, a gamble that would allow them to break the blockade and return to the safety of the Nile. As the 2nd of September dawns, the wind finally shifts, breathing life into the heavy sails. The two armadas begin to move toward one another, a slow-motion dance of wood and iron. The scale of the battle is difficult to fathom. Hundreds of ships, tens of thousands of men, all converging in a narrow strait. The Roman vessels under Octavian are smaller and more maneuverable, darting like dragonflies around the lumbering giants of the Egyptian fleet. The sound is a deafening cacophony of splintering wood, the rhythmic beat of the rowers' drums, and the cries of men lost to the turquoise depths. From her position in the rear, Cleopatra watches the chaos unfold. She sees the lines beginning to buckle, the tactical cohesion of Antony's forces dissolving under the relentless pressure of the Roman maneuvers. Then comes the moment that history has debated for over 2,000 years. A gap opens in the center of the fray, a fleeting window of opportunity created by the shifting winds and the positioning of the ships. Cleopatra, sensing that the battle is already lost and fearing the capture of her person and her treasury, gives the signal. The purple sails of her flagship are unfurled, catching the breeze, and she begins to pull away from the carnage. It is a calculated retreat, a desperate attempt to save the core of her power so that she might fight another day. But as her 60 ships glide southward, Antony sees her departure. In a moment of profound psychological collapse, he leaves his men, his honor, and his command, leaping into a small galley to follow the woman who has become his entire world. The psychological impact of this retreat is more devastating than the physical loss of the ships. For the soldiers left behind at Actium, the sight of their leaders fleeing is a betrayal that cannot be mended by words or gold. The sun sets over a sea littered with the wreckage of a dream, and as the Roman net begins to tighten, the atmosphere on Cleopatra's ship is one of heavy, suffocating grief. Antony sits at the prow for 3 days in total silence, his head buried in his hands, refusing to speak or eat. He is a man who has lost his identity, a Roman consul who has abandoned his post, a soldier who has turned his back on the field. Cleopatra, though she has saved her fleet and her treasury, must now navigate the wreckage of her partner's spirit. The journey back to Alexandria is slow, the water passing beneath the hull with a mournful, steady rhythm. The Mediterranean, once their playground, now feels like a vast, empty cage. As they sail past the familiar coastlines, the news of the defeat travels faster than the wind. Cleopatra knows that the illusion of invincibility has been shattered. She begins to prepare for the arrival of the victor, her mind already turning over the possibilities of defense, of diplomacy, and of the final, dark contingencies that every ruler must consider. She keeps her composure, her face a mask of royal dignity, even as the walls of her world begin to close in. When the lighthouse of Pharos finally appears on the horizon, its white stone gleaming like a ghost in the distance, there is no triumphal procession. The return to Alexandria is a quiet affair, a homecoming shadowed by the knowledge that the Roman legions will soon follow. The city is as beautiful as ever, its wide boulevards smelling of jasmine and sea salt, its libraries filled with the wisdom of the ages, but the air feels thinner now. Cleopatra walks through the halls of her palace, the soft tap of her sandals echoing on the mosaic floors, and she looks at her children, the heirs to a legacy that is slowly being erased from the map. In these long twilight months following Actium, a strange sort of peace settles over the court. It is the peace of the inevitable, the calm that comes when the struggle is no longer about winning, but about how one chooses to meet the end. Antony attempts to find solace in the company of his friends, forming a society they call the Inseparable Dyers, a group dedicated to spending their remaining days in luxury and philosophical reflection. They feast, they drink the finest wines of the Aegean, and they watch the sun set over the great harbour, knowing that each day brings Octavian's army a few miles closer through the sands of Syria and Libya. Cleopatra, however, does not succumb to the same lethargy. Her genius is still at work, even in the shadows. She experiments with various potions and venoms, observing their effects with a scientist's detachment, seeking a way out that is swift and painless, a way to maintain her agency when all other doors are barred. She considers dragging her ships across the desert to the Red Sea, hoping to flee to the distant lands of the east, but the local tribes burn her vessels before the plan can come to fruition. The world is shrinking, the borders of her kingdom drawing inward until they encompass little more than the walls of the city itself. As the Roman net tightens, the letters between Alexandria and Rome become more frequent, though they are filled with the hollow promises of a victor and the desperate negotiations of the vanquished. Octavian is a man of cold calculation. He wants the queen alive to grace his triumph in Rome, to be paraded in chains through the streets where she once walked as an equal to Caesar. Cleopatra knows this. She understands that her greatest enemy is not death, but the loss of her dignity and the subversion of her story. The nights in the palace are long and filled with the ghosts of what might have been. The queen sits by the window, the cool breeze from the harbour ruffling the linen of her gown. She can hear the distant murmur of the city, the people of Alexandria who still love her, who still see her as their living goddess, ignorant of the storm that is about to break upon their shores. She has lived a life of extraordinary brilliance, a life that defied the expectations of her gender and her time, and as the darkness deepens, she prepares for the final act of her reign. The strategic genius that guided her through the complexities of Roman politics and Egyptian tradition is now focused on a single, final goal, to ensure that her end is as legendary as her beginning, and that the name of Cleopatra remains etched into the stone of history long after the Roman legions have turned to dust. The scent of cedarwood and heavy incense drifts through the corridors of the royal quarter, where the stone remains cool even as the Egyptian heat presses against the city walls. Cleopatra moves through these final days with a quiet, calculated grace, her mind as sharp as the day she first stepped before Caesar. She understands that the architecture of a legacy is built not only in life, but in the manner of one's departure, and so she commissions the construction of a magnificent mausoleum near the temple of Isis. It is a structure of immense strength and beauty, designed to hold not just her physical form, but the vast treasures of the Ptolemaic Dynasty. Gold, silver, ebony, and pearls, all gathered in one final, defiant treasury that she threatens to put to the torch should the Romans press too close. In these quiet, shadowed hours, the queen turns her intellect toward the study of the transition itself. She is no longer looking for a way to win a war, but for a way to master the inevitable. Within the secluded chambers of her palace, she observes the effects of various toxins, seeking a path that is swift and devoid of the indignity of pain. She watches the way certain venoms bring a heavy, dreamlike sleep, while others cause the pulse to slow until it simply stops, like a lamp running out of oil. It is a grim science, yet she approaches it with the same scholarly precision she once applied to philosophy and linguistics, seeking a departure that maintains the dignity of the Pharaoh, a quiet exit that leaves her features unmarred and her spirit composed. The world outside her walls is shrinking as Octavian's forces draw a tightening circle around Alexandria. The diplomatic chess match continues, though the board is nearly empty. Cleopatra sends messengers to the Roman commander, her words carefully chosen to secure the future of her children. She asks for nothing for herself, offering to abdicate if only her sons and daughters might be allowed to inherit the throne of Egypt, to keep the line of the Ptolemy alive in the land of the Nile. But Octavian is a man of cold stone and calculated silences. He offers vague promises and hollow reassurances, his eyes fixed not on the preservation of a dynasty, but on the spectacle of a golden cage. He envisions Cleopatra led through the streets of Rome in chains, a living trophy to cement his own ascent to absolute power. Meanwhile, within the palace, Mark Antony is a shadow of the general he once was, caught in a tempest of despair and flickering hope. The news of the world reaching them is a chorus of betrayals, as governors and allies switch their allegiances to the rising sun of Rome. In a moment of profound misunderstanding, a false report reaches Antony, a whisper that Cleopatra has already taken her own life within the safety of her tomb. The grief is too much for a heart already worn thin by defeat. He falls upon his own sword, a final desperate act of a Roman who sees no path forward in a world without his queen. But the thread of life does not snap instantly. Bleeding and weakened, he learns that the report was false, that Cleopatra still breathes, waiting for him within the high walls of her mausoleum. He is carried to her, a tragic procession through the winding streets of a city that is falling silent. Because the doors of the tomb have been sealed from within to keep out the Roman soldiers, Cleopatra and her two faithful handmaidens, Iris and Charmian, must use ropes to pull the dying Antony up through an upper window. It is a scene of agonizing effort and profound sorrow. The Queen of Egypt, her hands stained with the blood of the man who shared her dreams of empire, straining against the weight to bring him into her final sanctuary. As he lies in her arms, the air in the mausoleum is thick with the smell of ancient dust and the sweetness of funeral spices. They share a final moment of intimacy, a quiet space carved out from the chaos of history. Cleopatra weeps, not as a monarch, but as a woman losing the partner of her greatest adventures. Antony, in his final breaths, urges her to make her peace with Octavian, to save herself if she can, and to remember the glory they once shared rather than the darkness of their present hour. He dies there, amidst the piles of gold and the silent statues of gods, leaving Cleopatra alone to face the victor who waits at the gates. She remains in the tomb for a time, a captive in her own monument, her body beginning to show the strain of grief and the hunger of a soul that has already begun to detach from the world. When Octavian's men finally find a way inside, scaling the walls while she is distracted, they find a woman who is disheveled but still radiates an undeniable authority. Even in her mourning, she attempts one last gambit, presenting the Roman officials with a list of her treasures, a calculated display of cooperation designed to mask her true intentions. She knows that Octavian intends to keep her alive only for the sake of his triumph in Rome, to parade the Eastern Queen before the shouting crowds. But Cleopatra has always been the master of her own narrative. She understands that to live as a prisoner is to allow Octavian to write the final chapter of her story, and that is a concession she will never make. She bathes, she dresses in her finest royal robes, and she sits down to a final, elegant meal, as if she is preparing for a grand state banquet rather than the end of an era. The air is still, the Mediterranean breeze barely stirring the linen hangings of her chamber. Every movement is deliberate, every gesture a testament to the strategic genius that has defined her life. She has made her preparations, she has found her painless end, and as the Roman guards stand watch outside, unaware of the quiet transformation occurring within, the last pharaoh prepares to step into the eternal embrace of the history she so carefully crafted. The scent of ripened fruit hangs heavy in the dim light of the mausoleum, a sweetness that masks the sharp tang of the salt air drifting in from the great harbour. Inside these stone walls, the world of politics and steel feels a lifetime away, replaced by the quiet rustle of silk and the soft, rhythmic breathing of two devoted handmaidens, Iris and Charmian. On a table of polished cedar sits a simple wicker basket, unassuming and rustic, filled to the brim with dark, succulent figs that seem to glow with a deep purple hue. Beneath those leaves, hidden away from the prying eyes of the Roman sentries, lies the instrument of a queen's final command. History has long whispered of the asp, the small, deadly cobra, known to the Egyptians as the uraeus, a creature that for 3,000 years had coiled itself around the brows of kings and queens as a symbol of divine protection and solar fire. To the Greeks, it was a terrifying bringer of shadow, but to Cleopatra, it was the messenger of a god, a bridge between the fleeting world of men and the eternal realm of the divine. There is a profound, quiet irony in the choice, that the very symbol of her royal power, the creature that once guarded her crown, would now be the one to release her from the weight of it. Some say she teased the serpent with a golden spindle, inviting the strike that would carry her away from the reach of Octavian's triumph, while others suggest she had long ago mastered the art of the apothecary, concealing a potent, painless draught within a hollow comb or the very fruit she kept by her side. Regardless of the physical means, the true power of this moment lies in its absolute sovereignty. Throughout her life, Cleopatra had been a master of timing, a woman who understood that the narrative of a ruler is written not just in their victories, but in the way they choose to depart the stage. By taking her own life, she denies Octavian his greatest prize, the sight of the Queen of Egypt led through the streets of Rome in golden chains, a living trophy to be stared at by the masses. She refuses to be a footnote in his story, choosing instead to remain the architect of her own. In this quiet, shaded room, she is not a defeated monarch, but a woman reclaiming her body and her legacy from the hands of an empire. As the poison begins its slow, cool journey through her veins, there is no panic, only a deep and resonant stillness. She dresses herself one final time in the full regalia of the pharaohs. The fine pleated linen that shimmers like moonlight, the heavy gold collars inlaid with lapis lazuli and turquoise, and the crown that signifies her status as the living Isis. She reclines upon a golden couch, her posture as poised and regal as if she were presiding over a banquet at the height of her power. There is a sense of completion in the air, a closing of a circle that began when she first stepped out of a carpet to face Julius Caesar so many years ago. Outside, the heavy thud of Roman boots echoes against the stone floor. Octavian's messengers, sensing something is amiss, burst through the doors, expecting to find a captive queen ready for transport. Instead, they are met with a sight that freezes them in their tracks. The room is silent, save for the flickering of a few oil lamps. Cleopatra lies perfectly still, her face serene, her features composed in a mask of eternal dignity. Iris lies dead at her feet, and Charmian, trembling but resolute, is clumsily adjusting the diadem upon her mistress's brow. When one of the soldiers demands to know if this was well done, Charmian finds the strength to offer one final, defiant reply. "It is well done and fitting for the descendant of so many kings." With those words, she too slips away, joining the queen she had served with such fierce loyalty. When Octavian himself finally enters the chamber, he finds a scene that he cannot conquer. He is a man who understands the power of imagery, and he sees immediately that Cleopatra has outmaneuvered him one last time. He had wanted to present her as a broken woman, a fallen temptress, but here she lies, radiating a quiet, unshakable majesty that even death cannot dim. There is a grudging respect in his gaze, perhaps even a flicker of awe. He orders that she be buried beside Mark Antony with all the honours due to a queen, acknowledging in that moment that she was a foe unlike any other, a mind so sharp and a spirit so vast that even the might of Rome could not truly contain her. The death of Cleopatra is more than the passing of a single woman. It is the final, echoing footfall of an era that had endured for 3 millennia. As her eyes closed for the last time, the long line of the pharaohs, stretching back to the dawn of civilization, finally came to an end. The temples of the Nile, with their towering pylons and secret sanctuaries, would remain, but the divine link between the gods and the people was severed. Egypt, once the most powerful and mysterious kingdom in the Mediterranean, was reduced to a mere province of the Roman Empire, a breadbasket intended to feed the growing hunger of a distant city. Yet in her passing, Cleopatra ensured that her story would never truly fade into the dust of the desert. She had transformed herself from a mortal ruler into a myth, a figure who would haunt the imagination of poets, painters, and historians for 2,000 years. The strategic genius she displayed in her final hours was her greatest gift to the future, a reminder that even when the world seems to be closing in, there is a power in choosing one's own path, in maintaining one's dignity against impossible odds. The Mediterranean waves continue to lap against the shores of Alexandria, much as they did when she first looked out at the sea and dreamed of an empire. The city she loved, with its great library and its towering lighthouse, would change hands many times, its marble palaces eventually sinking beneath the waves or being repurposed by new conquerors. But the memory of the woman who ruled it remains as vivid as the colours of a desert sunrise. She was the last of the Ptolemies, the last of the pharaohs, and a woman who understood that the only true way to live forever is to craft a story that the world can never forget. As the sun sets over the delta, casting long amber shadows across the silt and the reeds, a profound silence settles over the land. The busy markets of the city grow quiet, the ships in the harbour bob gently on the tide, and the ancient stones of the pyramids stand watch in the distance, indifferent to the shifting fortunes of men. The reign of the pharaohs has ended, but the reign of Cleopatra, the queen who conquered death through the sheer force of her will, has only just begun to echo through the halls of time. A soft, measured heartbeat that continues to pulse beneath the surface of history, inviting us to remember the brilliance, the passion, and the strategic genius of the woman who refused to be forgotten. The heavy silence that followed the final breath of the queen did not signal a return to the old ways, but rather the birth of a cold, new reality that settled over the Nile like a winter mist. In the wake of the tragedy at the mausoleum, the land of the pharaohs underwent a transformation unlike any it had seen in its 3,000 years of history. Egypt was no longer a sovereign kingdom, nor was it a mere province of the Roman Republic in the way that Gaul or Hispania were governed. Instead, Octavian, the man who would soon be known as Augustus, claimed the entire nation as his own private estate. It was his personal treasury, his granary, and his private sanctuary, governed by a prefect of his choosing rather than the Roman Senate. No senator was even permitted to set foot upon Egyptian soil without the emperor's express permission, for Octavian understood all too well the intoxicating power this land held. He knew that to control the Nile was to control the heartbeat of the Mediterranean. As the Roman administration moved into the palaces of Alexandria, the fate of Cleopatra's children hung in the balance, caught between the mercy and the cold pragmatism of the victor. Caesarion, the boy who bore the name and the likeness of Julius Caesar, represented a threat that Octavian could not allow to persist. To have a living son of Caesar, a true blood heir, was a shadow over Octavian's own claim as the adopted successor, and so the young King of Kings was quietly removed from the pages of living history, his reign erased, his future stolen before it could truly begin. It is said that Octavian's advisers whispered that too many Caesars is not a good thing, and with those few words the line of the great Julius and the last Pharaoh was severed. The other children, the three born to Mark Antony, met a different fate, one that was perhaps kinder but nonetheless steeped in the melancholy of exile. Alexander Helios, Cleopatra Selene, and young Ptolemy Philadelphus were taken to Rome, paraded in Octavian's triumph in golden chains that were said to be so heavy they could barely walk, yet they were not executed. Instead, they were handed over to the care of Octavia, the sister of Augustus and the former wife of their father. In a gesture of calculated Roman virtue, Octavia raised them as if they were her own, though they lived in the shadow of the very man who had dismantled their mother's empire. Cleopatra Selene would eventually grow to become a powerful queen in her own right in Mauritania, carrying the sophisticated culture of Alexandria to the edges of North Africa, a living ember of her mother's fire burning in a distant land. Meanwhile, in Rome, Augustus began the delicate work of crafting his own legacy by reshaping the memory of the woman he had defeated. He did not seek to bury Cleopatra's name, for a victory over a weak foe would bring him little glory. Instead, he magnified her. Through the pens of poets like Horace and Virgil, she was painted as a foreign enchantress, a dangerous, shimmering threat whose defeat proved the moral superiority of Rome. By casting Cleopatra as a formidable, almost supernatural adversary, Augustus solidified his own image as the savior of the Republic, the man who had protected the traditional Roman virtues from the corrupting luxuries of the East. The image of the Egyptian queen became a foundational myth of the Roman Empire, a cautionary tale used to justify the new order of the Principate. As the years passed, Alexandria herself began to change, though she remained the jewel of the Mediterranean. Under Roman rule, the city's intellectual life continued to thrive, but the atmosphere grew more orderly, more disciplined. The great library still hummed with the quiet rustle of papyrus scrolls, and the Pharaoh's lighthouse still cast its guiding beam across the dark waves. But the wild, theatrical spirit of the Ptolemaic court had been replaced by the efficient machinery of empire. The Greeks, the Jews, and the Egyptians who walked the wide, colonnaded streets of the city found themselves living in a world where the ultimate authority resided thousands of miles away in Rome. The temples of the Nile were still maintained, and Augustus even allowed himself to be depicted on their walls in the traditional garb of a pharaoh, performing the ancient rites to satisfy the local priesthood. But it was a performance, a strategic mask worn to ensure the stability of his most precious possession. The wealth of Egypt began to flow toward the Tiber in a steady, relentless stream. The golden wheat of the Nile Delta filled the bellies of the Roman masses, and the exotic stones of the eastern desert, the purple porphyry and the grey granite, were quarried to build the sprawling forums and temples of the capital. Rome was being rebuilt in marble, and it was Egypt's riches that paid the bill. Yet, even as the Romans extracted the physical wealth of the land, they found themselves seduced by its soul. The cult of Isis spread across the empire, finding its way into the heart of Rome itself, as the mystery and the ancient wisdom of Egypt offered something that the rigid Roman state religion could not. In a strange irony, the queen who had been defeated in battle saw her culture conquer the hearts of her captors. The transition into the Augustan age was a period of profound quietude, a pax romana that rested upon the foundations Cleopatra had tried so hard to protect. The queen had envisioned a world where East and West met in a partnership of equals, a Mediterranean empire centered on the brilliance of Alexandria. Augustus achieved a similar unity, but it was a unity of subjugation, where all roads led to Rome. And yet, one cannot help but feel her presence in the very architecture of the new era. Every time a Roman citizen gazed upon an obelisk transported to a Roman piazza, or a Roman poet struggled to describe the allure of the Orient, they were engaging with the ghost of the last Pharaoh. The erasure of Caesarion and the absorption of the Ptolemaic treasures were meant to close the book on the Old World, but history is rarely so tidy. In the dust of the Egyptian archives and the quiet corners of the Serapeum, the memory of Cleopatra's strategic genius remained a whispered secret. She had known that the future belonged to those who could bridge the gap between cultures, and though she fell, the world that rose in her wake was irrevocably shaped by her ambition. The Roman Empire was not merely a continuation of the Republic. It was a hybrid, a creature born of the marriage between Roman steel and the ancient, sophisticated bureaucracy of the Nile that Cleopatra had mastered so thoroughly. As the sun sets over the Mediterranean, casting long purple shadows across the ruins of the Caesareum, we see a city that is both a monument to Roman power and a testament to a lost queen's vision. The streets of Alexandria continue to echo with the footsteps of merchants and scholars, and the air is still thick with the scent of salt and spices. The Augustan age brought peace, but it was a peace bought with the disappearance of a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries. The transition was complete, the province was secure, and the emperor sat upon his throne in Rome, confident that he had silenced the voice of the Nile. Yet, beneath the calm surface of the Roman peace, the legacy of Cleopatra continued to pulse, a soft, rhythmic reminder that even the greatest empires are built upon the dreams of those they have displaced, a gentle hum of history that carries us into the depths of a quiet, restorative sleep. The transformation of Egypt was not merely one of politics, but of the very landscape itself. The Roman engineers, with their obsession for order, began to refine the irrigation systems that the Ptolemies had maintained, ensuring that every drop of the Nile's flood was accounted for. They mapped the stars with the same precision, blending the astronomical traditions of the Egyptian priests with the practical needs of Roman navigation. In the markets, the coins of the realm now bore the sharp, youthful profile of Augustus, but the goods they bought, the fine linens, the papyrus, the emeralds from the Red Sea hills, remained the same treasures that Cleopatra had once used to dazzle her allies. The world was becoming smaller, more connected, and more predictable, yet it lost some of its vibrant, unpredictable magic in the process. We imagine the quiet evenings in the Roman villas of Alexandria, where the new governors sat on terraces overlooking the great harbour. They would watch the moon rise over the water, the same moon that had shone upon Cleopatra and Antony as they feasted in their final days. Perhaps these Roman officials felt a flicker of the same awe, a realization that they were merely the latest stewards of a land that was ancient before Rome was even a village of huts on the Palatine Hill. The weight of Egyptian history is a heavy thing, a slow-moving river of time that swallows the names of conquerors and converts them into myth. Augustus sought to be the master of this history, but in truth he became just another chapter in the eternal story of the Nile. As we drift further into the stillness of the night, we can almost hear the soft lap of the waves against the stone quays of the city. The bustle of the day has faded, and the grand designs of emperors and queens seem far away, softened by the passage of 2,000 years. The Augustan age was a time of building and of boundaries, a time when the world was measured and mapped, yet the spirit of the woman who defied that mapping remains. She is there in the resilience of the people, in the enduring beauty of the monuments, and in the very way we tell the story of power and passion. The land of Egypt, now a province, remained a place of mystery, a place where the gods still whispered in the wind that blew across the desert sands, reminding all who listened that while empires may rise and fall, the essence of the land remains unchanged, forever inviting us to rest, to dream, and to remember. The ink on the papyrus of history had barely dried before the image of the queen began to soften and blur, transforming from a woman of flesh and bone into a tapestry woven by the imaginations of those who never knew her name. As the centuries drifted by like the slow, silt-heavy waters of the Nile, the memory of Cleopatra was preserved not in the cold marble of official records, but in the flickering candlelight of medieval scriptoria. To the scholars of the Middle Ages, she was a figure of distant, almost terrifying wonder, a serpent of the Nile whose beauty was whispered to be a kind of alchemy, capable of turning the hearts of the world's most powerful men into wax. They saw her through a glass darkly, filtered through the moralizing lens of 1,000 years, yet even then they could not look away. She became a cautionary tale and a source of fascination, a woman who had dared to command the tides of fate. By the time the Renaissance dawned, bringing with it a hunger for the lost wisdom of the ancient world, Cleopatra had stepped out of the shadows of myth and into the vibrant light of literature. She was no longer merely a fallen monarch. She was becoming a character, a tragic heroine whose life was a stage for the grandest of human emotions. The poets and playwrights of the 16th and 17th centuries found in her a mirror for their own era's preoccupations with sovereignty and desire. They painted her in words of velvet and gold, imagining her on a barge with purple sails, the air around her heavy with the scent of rare perfumes. This was the moment the historical figure began to merge with the romanticized icon, a transition that allowed her to live forever in the collective dreams of the West. She was the intellectual brilliance of the East meeting the martial strength of the West, a bridge between two worlds that the poets sought to cross again and again. And so, the woman who had once studied the complex mathematics of the stars and the intricate politics of the Mediterranean was reimagined as a symbol of pure, intoxicating power. Yet beneath the layers of fiction, the true Cleopatra remained, a silent presence waiting to be rediscovered. As the modern age arrived, the search for her shifted from the pages of books to the very earth and sea that had once been her kingdom. For centuries, the royal quarters of Alexandria, the magnificent palaces where she had walked and governed, were believed to be lost forever, swallowed by the Mediterranean after a series of ancient earthquakes and tidal waves. But the sea has a way of preserving what it takes. Beneath the gentle lap of the waves in the harbour of modern Alexandria, silence reigns over a sunken world. Divers moving through the murky, emerald depths have found the colossal statues of her ancestors, the granite sphinxes that once guarded her doors, and the massive stone blocks that form the foundations of her life. There is a profound stillness in these underwater ruins, a sense of a city frozen in time, where the colourful fish now dart between the pillars of a queen's private sanctuary. The search for her lost tomb continues to be one of the great mysteries of archaeology, a quiet quest that leads researchers through the coastal sands and into the depths of the desert. Whether she lies in a hidden chamber beneath the temple of Taposiris Magna, or remains tucked away in a corner of the city, now under the waves, the absence of her physical remains only serves to heighten her presence in our minds. We look for her in the artifacts, a bronze coin bearing her sharp, determined profile, or a fragment of a glass vessel, that might have held the oils she used to scent her skin. Meanwhile, the perception of her genius has undergone a quiet revolution. No longer is she seen merely as a temptress or a romantic casualty of war. Modern eyes have begun to see the strategist, the linguist who spoke 9 languages, and the brilliant administrator who managed a kingdom's economy with a steady hand. She has emerged as a symbol of female power in an era that tried to deny it. A woman who used her intellect as her sharpest weapon. We see her now as a polymath, a scholar queen who spent as much time in the great library as she did in the throne room. This intellectual brilliance is the true crown she wears in the halls of history, a legacy of a mind that was as vast and deep as the river that sustained her people. As the years passed, Cleopatra became a vessel for our own changing values, a figure onto whom every generation projects its own hopes and fears. To some she is the ultimate diplomat, navigating the treacherous waters of Roman ambition to keep her country free. To others, she is the ultimate artist of her own image, a woman who understood the power of spectacle and used it to command the respect of emperors. The sensory details of her world, the cool touch of linen, the heat of the Egyptian sun, the taste of wine cooled in deep cellars, these things remain vivid in our imagination because she made herself unforgettable. She is the whisper in the reeds, the shadow on the temple wall, the name that lingers on the lips of those who study the past. In the quiet hours of the night, when the world is still and the mind begins to wander back through the corridors of time, we find her there. She is not a ghost, but a living thought, a reminder of what it means to live with purpose and to leave a mark upon the world that even the tides of 2,000 years cannot wash away. The serpent of the Nile has shed many skins over the centuries, evolving from a villain in the eyes of Rome to a goddess in the eyes of Egypt, and finally to a woman whose complexity defies simple categorization. She invites us to look past the myths and the movies, to see the quiet strength of a ruler who loved her land with a fierce, unwavering devotion. As we drift closer to the end of her story, the image of the city under the sea remains the most potent. It is a place of perpetual twilight, where the history of a civilization rests in the cool embrace of the water. There the statues of the Ptolemies lie on their sides, staring up through the blue toward a sun they haven't seen in a millennium. And yet, there is no sadness in this submerged kingdom, only a profound, watery peace. It is a sanctuary for the memory of a queen who understood that true power is not just in the holding of territory, but in the capturing of the human spirit. She remains the heartbeat of Alexandria, the soul of the Delta, and a guiding star for any who seek to understand the delicate balance between the heart and the head. The search for her tomb may one day yield a golden chamber or a simple stone sarcophagus, but in truth, she has already found her resting place. She lives in the curiosity of every student of history, in the creative spark of every artist she inspires, and in the enduring mystery of the land she called home. The desert wind continues to carry her name across the dunes, a soft, sibilant sound that blends with the rustle of the palms and the distant murmur of the sea. It is a sound that invites us to close our eyes, to let the weight of the present fall away, and to find rest in the timeless reign of the last Pharaoh. In this space of memory and myth, she is forever young, forever wise, and forever queen, watching over the quiet progress of the hours as the world turns towards sleep. The ink upon the papyrus has long since dried, and the reeds that once provided the surface for her decrees now sway in the gentle currents of the delta, unbothered by the weight of empires or the passage of centuries. To understand Cleopatra is to look past the gilded veil of Roman propaganda and the soft focus lens of modern drama, finding instead a woman of cold calculation and warm intelligence who understood the geometry of power better than any of her contemporaries. She was not a queen of chance, but a queen of intent, a ruler who spoke the languages of her subjects and the languages of her enemies with equal fluency, weaving them into a tapestry of survival that held the Mediterranean in its grip for nearly 3 decades. We often think of her through the prism of the men she loved, yet for Cleopatra, these alliances were the masterstrokes of a strategist who knew that the heart of Egypt could only beat so long as the pulse of Rome was synchronized with her own. The air in the great halls of Alexandria was thick with the scent of cedarwood and aged parchment, a stillness that spoke of the immense intellectual wealth she fought so fiercely to protect. While the world remembers the battles of Actium or the dramatic finality of the palace in the wake of defeat, her true legacy lived in the quiet corridors of the Mousseon, where the light of the Pharos lighthouse guided not just ships, but the very progress of human thought. She was the patron of a culture that refused to be extinguished, a guardian of the celestial observations, the medical treatises, and the epic poetry that formed the bedrock of the ancient world. Even as the political borders of her kingdom shifted like the desert sands, the intellectual fire she stoked remained a beacon, ensuring that the wisdom of the Nile would survive long after the last pharaoh had laid down her crown. And so, we see her now as more than a figure of tragedy. She is a symbol of the enduring human spirit that seeks to build something permanent in a world of constant flux. Her strategic genius was a form of architecture, a way of constructing a reality where her people could flourish amidst the gathering storms of conquest. As the years passed and the Roman historians began to rewrite her story, they could not erase the fact that she had nearly reshaped the map of the known world, envisioning a Mediterranean empire where East and West were not rivals, but partners in a grand Hellenistic experiment. This vision was as vast as the sea itself, stretching from the marble columns of her capital to the distant reaches of the incense roots, a dream of connectivity and culture that whispered of what might have been had the winds of fortune blown in a different direction. The cycle of history is much like the seasonal flooding of the Nile, a rhythmic rise and fall that brings both destruction and the promise of new life. Cleopatra understood this better than most, recognizing that her reign was a single brilliant moment in a timeline that stretched back thousands of years to the builders of the pyramids. She walked the same halls as the gods, her footsteps echoing in the temples of Dendera and Philae, where her image was carved into the very stone to remind the stars of her presence. There is a profound peace in this continuity, a sense that nothing is ever truly lost, but merely transformed into the silt that nourishes the next generation. The queen, who once commanded fleets and dictated the fates of kings, is now a part of the earth and the water, her essence dispersed into the quiet atmosphere of the land she loved so deeply. In the twilight of her era, the city of Alexandria remained a jewel of the world, its streets laid out in a perfect grid that mirrored the order she sought to maintain. We can imagine her walking through the royal gardens at night, when the heat of the day had finally retreated, and the fragrance of jasmine and lotus hung heavy in the air. The sound of the Mediterranean waves against the harbour walls provided a constant, rhythmic backdrop to her thoughts, a reminder of the vast, blue expanse that both connected her to the world and isolated her from it. In those moments of solitude, away from the demands of the throne and the whispers of counsellors, she was simply a woman looking out at the horizon, contemplating the infinite nature of the cosmos and her place within its intricate design. The library, with its hundreds of thousands of scrolls, was the heartbeat of her kingdom, a repository of everything humanity had learned of the stars, the earth, and the soul. She knew that power was fleeting, but knowledge was eternal, and she invested her spirit into the preservation of this collective memory. When we think of the flame of civilization, we must think of the woman who held the torch high during the darkening hours of the late Republic, ensuring that the light of the Ptolemies did not flicker out without a final, magnificent flare. Her intellect was her greatest weapon, and her curiosity was her greatest gift, allowing her to bridge the gap between the ancient traditions of the pharaohs and the emerging realities of a Roman world. As the story of her life draws to a close, we find ourselves returning to the water, to the deep, cool embrace of the sea that eventually claimed the palaces and the monuments of her reign. Beneath the surface of the Mediterranean, where the light filters down in shimmering shafts of turquoise and emerald, the ruins of her world lie in a state of perfect, silent repose. The great statues of granite and marble rest upon the seabed, covered in a fine layer of silt and the delicate growth of the reef, cradled by the tides that have flowed since the beginning of time. There is no noise here, no clamour of battle or political intrigue, only the slow, rhythmic pulse of the ocean and the gentle sway of the kelp forests. Cleopatra rests in this sanctuary of shadow and salt, far beneath the waves that once carried her gilded barge. The weight of the water is a heavy, comforting blanket, pressing down with a stillness that defies the passage of the hours. Here, the last pharaoh is finally at peace, her strategic mind at rest and her long journey through the annals of history complete. The gold of her crown has faded into the soft hues of the sand, and the brilliance of her eyes has become the sparkle of the sun upon the water's surface. She is no longer a queen of a single nation, but a queen of the elements, a part of the wind, the river, and the deep blue sea. The world above continues its restless spinning, the cities rising and falling, the names of rulers being written and erased in the book of time. But in the quiet depths, the memory of her genius remains unshaken, a steady presence that anchors the imagination of all who look toward the past. We can feel the slow, steady breath of the earth in the movement of the tides, a reminder that even the greatest of lives eventually finds its way back to the source. The Nile continues to flow, carrying the stories of the old world into the new, a liquid ribbon of memory that connects us to the woman who once stood at the center of it all. As you drift closer to the edge of sleep, let the image of the underwater palace fill your mind. The columns standing like silent sentinels in the blue gloom, the mosaics glowing faintly with the memory of the sun. There is a profound safety in this stillness, a sense of being held by history and protected by the vastness of the deep. The queen is there, watching over the quiet progress of the night, her reign eternal in the hearts of those who remember her not as a myth, but as a brilliant, breathing reality. The waves above are a distant murmur, a lullaby that sings of the ancient sands and the timeless river, guiding you toward a rest that is as deep and as peaceful as the sea itself. The shadows grow long across the ruins of the world, and the stars begin to appear one by one in the velvet sky, reflecting in the calm waters of the harbour. Everything is in its right place. The past is a soft